The afternoon sun filtered through the sprawling branches of City Park, casting dappled shadows across the neatly trimmed grass. It was an unremarkable day. The kind where the hum of distant traffic blended seamlessly with the rustling leaves, creating a quiet sanctuary for anyone seeking a moment's peace. Maya Williams stood near a weathered wooden bench, her coffee cup warming her palm as the faint aroma of roasted beans mingled with the crisp autumn air. In her other hand, her phone glowed softly. Emails scrolling past her eyes, messages from colleagues, updates on cases, the usual demands of her relentless schedule. A gentle breeze tugged at the edges of her coat, brushing through the tight curls of her hair, which she wore like a crown, a testament to her pride and resilience. For a fleeting second, she allowed herself to exhale. To let the tension of her day seep into the earth beneath her feet. This park, with its winding paths and towering oaks, had always been a refuge. A place where she could simply be, not Deputy Chief Williams, not the trailblazer carrying a city's hopes, just Maya. But that fragile calm shattered in an instant. A voice, loud, sharp, and dripping with unchecked authority, sliced through the stillness like a jagged knife. "What do you think you're doing here?" The words hit her with the force of a physical blow, jolting her from her reverie. Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing as she searched for the source. There he was, a tall figure striding toward her, his uniform crisp and imposing. His badge catching the sunlight in a glint that felt more like a threat than a promise of protection. His face was a mask of cold determination, his jaw set. His eyes narrowed as if he'd already judged her and found her wanting. Maya's heart stuttered, not out of fear but out of disbelief. She tightened her grip on her coffee cup. The heat seeping into her skin as she straightened her posture, instinctively summoning the composure that had carried her through years of scrutiny. "Excuse me," she replied. Her voice steady but laced with a quiet incredulity that betrayed her shock. She studied him, trying to make sense of the hostility radiating from this stranger. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers brushing the edge of his badge, a silent declaration of power. "I said, what are you doing here? Do you even belong here? Because you look out of place," he barked. Each syllable a deliberate jab, his tone cutting through the serene air like a whip. The accusation hung between them, heavy and suffocating. As if her very presence in this public space was a crime he'd been waiting to punish. Maya's brow furrowed, confusion warring with the slow burn of anger rising in her chest. She'd faced men like him before, too many times to count, men who saw her skin, her confidence, her existence, and decided she was a threat to their fragile order. But this? This was different. This was personal, raw, and unprovoked. "I'm just here for a moment," she said, her words measured, an attempt to douse the spark of his aggression before it ignited something worse. She gestured faintly with her coffee cup, a small, humanizing detail she hoped might remind him she wasn't some intruder to be interrogated. But her calm only seemed to stoke his fire. His lips curled into a sneer, and he took a step closer, his boots thudding against the pavement with deliberate weight. "Show me some ID," he demanded, his voice rising. A challenge wrapped in a command. Maya blinked, her breath catching as she processed the absurdity of it. "ID? What for?" "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her tone sharpening despite her efforts to keep it level. The air between them crackled with tension, the breeze doing little to cool the heat of her growing frustration. "You're loitering," he snapped, his voice booming now, drawing the attention of a jogger pausing mid-stride and an elderly couple on a nearby bench, their heads turning in unison. "I've seen people like you around here before, always causing trouble." The words landed like a slap, each one laced with venom, dripping with an implication he didn't bother to disguise. Maya's pulse quickened, her fingers tightening around her phone as she repeated his phrase in a whisper, "People like me?" Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the fury she fought to contain. What does that mean? She tilted her head, meeting his gaze head-on, daring him to say it outright. He leaned in, close enough that she could smell the faint tang of his aftershave. His smirk widening as if her defiance amused him. You know exactly what I mean. Don't play dumb. You think you can just waltz into any neighborhood and act like you belong? Her breath hitched. A sharp intake that burned her throat as she took a step back, reclaiming the space he'd invaded. The park, once a haven, now felt like a stage, the eyes of strangers boring into her. Their curiosity tinged with unease. I don't have to explain myself to you, she said, her voice low but firm, a steel thread running through it. I have every right to be here. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed off the trees. Every right? We'll see about that. Don't move. He reached for his radio, his fingers deft as he barked a code into it. Some cryptic string of numbers that sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt its weight, the way it shifted the air around them, turning a simple moment into something ominous. The onlookers lingered, their faces a gallery of muted reactions, some uncomfortable, some intrigued, but none willing to step forward. Maya's neck burned with the humiliation creeping up her skin, a searing reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away. The officer stood over her, his posture a tower of dominance. His chest puffed out as if he owned the park, the city, her very breath. You really think you're untouchable, don't you? He muttered. His voice dropping to a menacing whisper meant only for her ears. Well, let me make something clear, people like you never win. The words burrowed into her, igniting a fire she struggled to contain. Her fists clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms as every instinct screamed at her to lash out, to tear down his arrogance with the truth of who she was. But she held back. Her silence a shield, her mind racing with the bitter knowledge of how these encounters could spiral, how a single misstep could turn her into a statistic, a headline, a cautionary tale. Then came the sound of gravel crunching under boots. A second officer approached, his stride hesitant, his eyes darting between Maya and the first man. Younger, leaner. With a face still soft around the edges, he carried none of the swagger of his partner. Are you sure about this? He whispered, his voice barely audible. A flicker of doubt creasing his brow as he glanced at Maya. She caught the unease in his expression, the way his hand hovered near his belt, not out of threat but uncertainty. The first officer whirled on him, his tone a lash of authority. I'm in charge here. Now get back to your patrol. The younger man flinched, his shoulders slumping as he retreated, casting one last apologetic look over his shoulder. Maya watched him go, a pang of pity mixing with her anger. He was complicit, yes. But trapped, caught in the shadow of a man too drunk on power to see the line he'd crossed. The first officer turned back to her, his tirade unrelenting. He questioned her every move, why she'd chosen this park, what she was really doing with that phone, whether she was casing the area or plotting some vague disruption. Each accusation grew wilder, more absurd, a barrage of nonsense that battered her dignity with every syllable. She stood frozen, every muscle taut, the coffee in her hand long gone cold. The weight of his words pressed down on her, suffocating, until something inside her snapped, not with violence, but with clarity. I'm done with this, she said, her voice slicing through his rant like a blade honed by years of patience. I've tried to be civil, but you've crossed a line. He scoffed, folding his arms across his chest, his smirk returning as if her defiance was a game he'd already won. Oh, really? And what exactly are you going to do about it? She met his gaze, her eyes blazing with a quiet, unyielding fire that seemed to catch him off guard, if only for a heartbeat. He masked it quickly, stepping forward again, his presence looming. You can either cooperate, or I can take you down to the station. Your choice. The threat hung in the air, thick and oppressive, as the crowd around them grew, joggers, dog walkers, a mother pushing a stroller, all watching. Their silence deafening. Maya's chest tightened, her mind a whirlwind of fury and calculation. She wanted to scream, to dismantle his arrogance with the weight of her title, her story, her truth. But she breathed instead, deep and deliberate, forcing the storm within her to still. She needed the right moment, the perfect opening to turn this encounter on its head. Because what this officer didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that he'd just stepped into a reckoning. Maya wasn't just any woman in a park. She was Deputy Chief Maya Williams. The first black woman to climb the ranks of this city's police force, a beacon of justice forged in the fires of adversity. Her life had been a testament to resilience, raised on the South Side by a mother who taught her to stand tall, clawing her way through a system stacked against her. Carrying the dreams of a community on her shoulders. And this man, with his badge and his bluster, had no idea the storm he'd unleashed. His downfall wouldn't come from her fists or her words, not yet. It would come from the quiet power of her position, the unshakable truth of her purpose, and the consequences of a system that could no longer shield his abuse of power. The park faded into the background, the breeze a distant whisper as the stakes sharpened into focus. This wasn't just about one afternoon, one confrontation. It was about justice, the kind that doesn't bend to arrogance, the kind that demands accountability. His prejudice had blinded him, and that blindness would be his ruin. As the tension pulsed between them, Maya's resolve hardened. She'd spent her life proving she belonged, here, in this park, in her uniform, in every space she claimed. And now, she'd make sure he learned the cost of underestimating her. The lesson would be brutal, not because she craved revenge, but because justice, when wielded by someone who'd earned it, left no room for mercy. The city would watch, stunned, as one man's hubris unraveled everything he thought he controlled. And Maya? She'd keep walking forward, head high, her coffee cup still in hand. Ready to rewrite the story he'd tried to force upon her. The trust between the community and its protectors hung by a thread, delicate and fraying. And Maya had poured every ounce of herself into mending it. Night after night, she sat in the dimly lit town hall, its wooden benches creaking under the weight of restless residents. Their voices spilled out in a torrent, anger, fear, exhaustion, each word a plea for someone to hear them, to care. She listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her dark eyes tracing the worn lines of their faces. These weren't just complaints to her, they were echoes of her own life. Scars she carried from a childhood where the system had failed her family time and again. Every decision she made now, every step she took in her role, was laced with that ache. A quiet determination to turn their shared pain into something better. Across town, Officer Darren Mitchell steered his patrol car through the dusk. The hum of the engine a familiar companion as his shift wound down. With over 10 years on the force, Darren wore his experience like a badge of honor. Though it was tarnished by whispers and grievances that followed him like shadows. His broad shoulders and sharp jawline gave him an air of command. But his reputation was a jagged thing, built on a foundation of brashness and a heavy hand that left bruises, both literal and figurative. Complaints had piled up over the years. Scribbled notes of outrage from citizens who'd felt his wrath, yet they always seemed to vanish into the ether. His superiors shrugged them off. Muttering about old-school methods, or waving away accusations as mere missteps. Darren didn't just survive in this system, he thrived in it, his confidence unshaken. His belief in his own righteousness absolute. To him, order was king, and he ruled it with an iron grip. Where others saw aggression, he saw strength. Where they saw prejudice, he saw clarity. People like Maya, those bleeding heart reformers who prattled on about community and trust, were nothing but naive dreamers, meddlers who couldn't fathom the gritty truth of his world. She was a threat, a crack in the armor of the way things had always been, and he despised her for it. That afternoon, the park stretched out before him. A patchwork of green under a sky bruised with clouds. Darren's boots crunched against the gravel path as he scanned the area, his gaze sharp and restless. Then he saw her, Maya, standing near a weathered bench, her figure framed by the drooping branches of an oak. She was engrossed in her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. Oblivious to the world around her. To Darren, she didn't belong. She wasn't a face he knew, not a colleague or a superior, just another stranger in a place he'd claimed as his domain. His mind raced. Sifting through the filters he'd built over years of unchecked power, her clothes, her posture, the color of her skin, and landed on suspicion. Without hesitation, he strode toward her. His chest puffed out, his voice already sharpening into a blade. "Hey," he barked, the words slicing through the quiet air. "What are you doing here?" His tone dripped with condescension. Each syllable a challenge. Maya's head snapped up, her fingers pausing mid-scroll. For a split second, her breath caught, a flicker of recognition passing through her, not of him, but of this moment. This script she'd lived too many times before. She straightened, meeting his glare with a steady gaze, though inside, a storm churned. Anger simmered in her chest, hot and familiar. Mingling with the dull ache of humiliation. She could feel the weight of his judgment, the way it stripped her down to nothing but a stereotype. Around them, heads turned, joggers slowing their pace. An elderly man on a nearby bench glancing up from his newspaper, but no one stepped closer. Their curiosity was a silent, suffocating thing. Darren pressed on, his voice rising. Carrying across the park like a warning shot. "You don't look like you're from around here. What's your business?" His words weren't just questions, they were accusations. Laced with a smugness that made her skin prickle. Maya's jaw tightened, but she refused to crumble. She'd faced men like him before, bullies cloaked in badges. Drunk on their own authority, and she'd learned how to stand tall. "I have every right to be here," she replied, her voice low but unshaken, each word deliberate. "Do you?" It was a quiet defiance. A mirror held up to his bluster, and it only fueled his irritation. To Darren, this was a game of dominance, a chance to flex his power. To Maya, it was a crucible. Testing the strength she'd forged through years of fighting for her place. The exchange escalated, a dance of tension that drew more eyes, children pausing their play. A woman clutching her dog's leash a little tighter. Darren's face reddened, his hands flexing at his sides as if itching to grab something, anything, to reassert control. Maya felt the sting of his words deepen, each one a calculated jab meant to wound, to remind her of the invisible lines he believed she'd crossed. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She stood rooted, her chin lifted, her heart pounding with a mix of fury and resolve. For the onlookers, it was a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the chasm that split their city, a wound that bled mistrust and division. Neither Darren nor Maya knew it then, but this clash was a spark. The first tremor of a reckoning that would ripple far beyond that park. As Darren stalked away, his boots kicking up dust, Maya remained where she stood, the air thick with the aftermath. Her thoughts spun like a whirlwind, anger at his arrogance, frustration at the system that propped him up, sorrow for the silent witnesses who'd done nothing. She could still hear the echo of his voice, the cruel edge of it slicing through her calm. She'd seen his kind before, men who mistook their badges for crowns. Who thought power was theirs to wield without question. But what gnawed at her now wasn't just Darren. It was the bystanders, their averted eyes and hunched shoulders, their refusal to intervene. That silence felt heavier than his words, a betrayal that settled deep in her bones. Back at her office, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Maya sank into her chair. Her desk was a fortress of order, stacks of papers aligned with precision, a glowing computer screen casting a soft light across her face. Beside it sat a framed photo of her son, Jordan. His gap-toothed grin a beacon in the storm of her day. She picked up her phone, scrolling through emails and reports, but her mind was miles away, replaying the park. This wasn't about her pride, it never had been. It was about the pattern, the way men like Darren flourished while the system turned its back. Her reverie broke with a soft knock. Carla, her assistant, stepped in, her round face etched with worry. In her 40s, Carla was a steady presence, organized, perceptive, with a warmth that softened the edges of their hard-edged world. "I heard about earlier," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Are you okay?" Maya managed a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Carla. I've handled worse." Carla shut the door and leaned against it, arms crossed, her expression shifting to quiet indignation. "You shouldn't have to handle it at all. Darren's been a loose cannon for years, you know it." "I know it." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. She did know. His name had crossed her desk too often, tethered to complaints that evaporated under the weight of bureaucracy. But taking him on meant wading through a mire of politics, a fight she'd have to wage with both hands tied. "It's not just him," she said after a pause. "He's a symptom. If I go after one man, I'm patching a leak instead of fixing the flood." Carla's gaze softened, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. "I get it. But you don't have to do this alone, Maya. There are people here who see what you see, who want what you want." Maya nodded, grateful but unswayed. The burden didn't lighten, it never did. As Carla slipped out, Maya leaned back, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Darren's actions weren't isolated, they were a mirror to a system rotten with neglect, a warning of what happened when power went unchecked. Justice demanded more than words, it demanded action, and she wouldn't let this fade into the background. Not this time. Meanwhile, Darren barreled home, his jaw tight, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The encounter gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't dislodge. He still didn't know who she was, and that ignorance festered. Her composure, calm, unshaken, had rattled him more than he'd admit. Most people flinched under his stare, bent beneath his authority, but not her. Instead of questioning himself, he twisted it in his mind. Her defiance was the problem, her refusal to bow. At home, he flung his keys onto the counter, the clatter sharp against the silence, and dropped onto his sagging couch. The TV flickered. A dull hum of noise he ignored. His thoughts churned, fixating on her, those steady eyes, that quiet strength he couldn't name. It wasn't fear he'd seen, it was something else. Something that left him off balance. His phone buzzed, snapping him back. A text from Officer Baker. Drinks later, Darren's thumbs tapped out a quick yeah, craving the distraction. That night, at their usual dive bar, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the clink of bottles, he and Baker hunched over their beers. Baker was a wiry man with a quick laugh and a shared disdain for the department's soft turn. "Heard you had a run-in today," Baker said, smirking. Darren grunted, taking a long swig. "Some woman in the park. Didn't like my tone, I guess." Baker chuckled, but Darren's mind drifted. He didn't mention how she'd stood her ground, how her words had lingered. He didn't have to, Baker wouldn't get it. To them, the world was simple, authority ruled, and those who questioned it were the enemy. What neither man knew, what no one could have predicted, was that this fleeting clash would unravel everything. Maya's fight was just beginning. A battle against not just Darren but the machinery that shielded him. And Darren, blind to the storm brewing, would soon learn that power without consequence was a fragile illusion. Justice. Slow and relentless, was closing in, and the lessons it carried, of accountability, of the ruin that follows unchecked abuse, would reshape their world in ways they couldn't yet fathom. The dim glow of the bar's neon sign flickered through the grimy window, casting jagged shadows across the worn wooden table where Darren and Baker sat. The air smelled faintly of stale beer and fried food, a familiar refuge for the two officers after a long shift. Their conversation drifted as it often did, circling back to the same tired complaints about the department. They grumbled about the relentless push for reform, the tightening grip of oversight that felt more like a noose than a lifeline. Baker leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood punctuating his frustration as he shook his head. "She's a real piece of work, isn't she? Always harping on about accountability and transparency, like she's blind to what we're dealing with out there." His voice carried the weight of exhaustion, tinged with a bitter edge. Darren's fingers hovered over the neck of his beer bottle, the cold glass grounding him as he frowned. The mention of her, this new deputy chief, stirred something uneasy in his chest. A faint spark of recognition he couldn't quite place. "What's her name again?" he asked, forcing his tone to stay light, casual, as if the answer didn't matter. Baker smirked, oblivious to the storm brewing behind Darren's eyes. "Maya Williams," he said, taking a swig of his drink. The name hit Darren like a punch to the gut. His grip tightened. The bottle slick with condensation as his mind raced. Maya Williams, it wasn't just familiar, it was a memory clawing its way to the surface, sharp and vivid. He saw her now, the woman from the park. Standing tall and unflinching, her gaze cutting through him like she'd already sized him up and found him wanting. That look made sense now. Retroactively stitching together the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. A cold knot twisted in his stomach, dread seeping into his bones. "I think I ran into her today," Darren said. The words slipping out slow and heavy, laced with a disbelief he couldn't shake. "But I didn't know who she was." Baker's eyebrow arched, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes. "What do you mean?" he pressed, leaning forward slightly. Darren hesitated, his mind replaying the encounter in jagged flashes, the way he'd approached her, the assumptions he'd made. The edge in his voice he hadn't bothered to soften. He didn't want to spill the whole story, not even to Baker, who'd seen him through worse. "Let's just say it wasn't a stellar first impression," he muttered, forcing a weak grin. Baker let out a bark of laughter, clapping Darren's shoulder with a rough hand. "Well, good luck, man. She's not the type to let anything slide." Darren managed a chuckle, but it felt hollow, a flimsy mask over the panic swelling inside him. He couldn't shake the gnawing certainty that he'd crossed a line, one that might unravel everything he'd built. Across town, in the quiet hum of her office, Maya Williams sat hunched over a desk cluttered with files and notes. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting stark shadows across the papers she'd spent hours poring over. She knew confronting Darren wouldn't be simple. His name had surfaced too many times in the complaints she'd dug up, reports buried under layers of bureaucratic dust. Dismissed with a shrug or a signature. But this wasn't just about him. It was about the rot festering in the department, a culture that shielded its own while turning a blind eye to the fallout. Maya's pen scratched against a legal pad as she jotted down another detail, her movements precise despite the fatigue tugging at her. She felt a strange cocktail of emotions, anticipation curling tight in her chest, apprehension simmering beneath it. This path was a minefield, but she'd chosen it knowingly. Steeling herself for the fight ahead. Darren didn't yet grasp the storm gathering on his horizon, but Maya did. Justice wasn't a question of if anymore, it was a matter of when. And how he'd face the wreckage when it came. Monday morning broke over the precinct with its usual rhythm, the clatter of keyboards, the murmur of voices blending into a low drone. The bitter scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Darren arrived early, his boots scuffing the linoleum as he made his way to his desk. His movements were quick, almost mechanical. But there was a stiffness in his shoulders, a tension he couldn't shake. The weekend had been a blur of restless nights, his mind looping back to that moment in Lincoln Park. He could still see her standing there, the late afternoon sun glinting off her dark hair, her posture radiating a quiet defiance he'd mistaken for something else. He'd replayed every word, every gesture, until the truth sank in like a stone. Maya Williams wasn't just some bystander he could brush off. She was his superior, the one person with the authority, and, he suspected, the will, to hold his feet to the fire. The realization twisted his unease into something sharper, a dread that clung to him like damp clothes. Meanwhile, Maya stepped into the precinct with her head held high, her heels clicking against the floor in a steady, deliberate rhythm. To anyone watching, she was the picture of composure, her navy blazer crisp, her expression calm, but her eyes burned with a quiet intensity. She'd spent the last 2 days buried in Darren's file, sifting through a trail of complaints that painted a damning picture. Excessive force, inappropriate remarks, patterns of bias that had been ignored or excused. It wasn't shocking, not really, but it fueled a slow, simmering anger in her gut. This wasn't just about one officer's missteps, it was about a system that let men like Darren thrive, shielding them from consequences while others paid the price. Today was about more than a reprimand. It was about planting a flag, drawing a line that couldn't be crossed again. She moved through the station with purpose, her arms cradling a thick folder stuffed with evidence she'd painstakingly compiled. The conference room loomed ahead, its glass walls offering a clear view of the officers already gathered inside. Darren sat near the end of the long table, his broad frame slouched slightly, his fingers drumming an uneven beat against the wood. As Maya pushed the door open, the room fell silent. A dozen pairs of eyes swiveling to her. The air thickened with unspoken tension, the weight of what was coming pressing down on everyone. Darren's jaw tightened as their gazes locked. A flicker of defiance warring with the fear creeping up his spine. "Good morning, everyone," Maya said, her voice smooth but edged with steel as she set the folder down with a soft thud. "Before we get started, I'd like to address an incident that happened recently." The officers exchanged wary glances, the atmosphere growing heavier with each passing second. Darren shifted in his seat, his palms slick against the table's edge. Maya's eyes swept the room, taking in every face before settling on him. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her tone sharpening like a blade, "I believe you had an interaction with me last Friday at Lincoln Park." Darren swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. I didn't realize it was you." "Deputy Chief," he stammered, the words tumbling out clumsy and weak. Maya's lips curved into a faint, mirthless smile, her expression unyielding. "No, you didn't. And that's exactly the problem. Isn't it? You didn't know who I was, yet you felt entitled to question my presence, to make assumptions about me. Care to explain that?" The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the ragged sound of Darren clearing his throat. "I thought you looked suspicious," he said, the excuse sounding flimsy even to him. "It was a misunderstanding." Maya's gaze didn't waver, her voice dropping to a low, cutting register. "A misunderstanding? Tell me, Officer Mitchell, how often do these misunderstandings happen? Because your record suggests this is far from the first time." Darren's face flushed, a volatile mix of anger and shame heating his skin. "I was doing my job," he shot back, his voice rising with a defensive edge. "It wasn't personal." Maya leaned forward slightly, her presence commanding the room. "Not personal," she echoed, her tone slicing through his bravado. "You accused me of not belonging in a public park. You humiliated me in front of strangers, and now you claim it wasn't personal? Let me ask you this. If I'd been someone else, someone who looked different, would you have done the same? Darren opened his mouth, but the words stalled, his mind scrambling for a defense that wouldn't dig him deeper. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, until Maya broke it. "I've reviewed your record, Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice steady but heavy with authority. She reached for the folder, pulling out a stack of documents and spreading them across the table. Excessive force. Inappropriate language. Racially biased behavior. Complaints that were dismissed, overlooked, or buried. You've dodged accountability for years, but that stops today. The room seemed to hold its breath, the other officers frozen in their seats. Some stared at the table, avoiding the scene unfolding before them, others shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their own complicity settling over them like dust. Darren's hands balled into fists beneath the table, his knuckles widening as anger churned inside him. "You can't do this," he growled, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "I've given over a decade to this department. I've served this city." "You've abused your power," Maya cut in, her words ringing with finality. "And you did it because you thought no one would call you out. You were wrong. This isn't just about you, it's about making sure no one else in this room follows your lead." The air was thick with tension, Darren's defiance crumbling under the weight of her resolve. Deep down, he knew there was no way out. Maya's words were a reckoning, forcing him to face the consequences he'd spent years outrunning. As the meeting drew to a close, Maya gathered her papers with a deliberate calm, her gaze lingering on Darren one last time. "You'll be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Internal affairs will take it from here." Darren didn't respond, he couldn't. The gravity of his situation pressed down on him. A suffocating weight he couldn't escape. The other officers filed out in silence, their footsteps echoing in the hall, each one grappling with the lesson etched into the moment. Power without accountability was a hollow shield, and justice, when it came, spared no one. The weight of it all had finally crashed down on Darren, and now he sat motionless at his desk. His mind a chaotic swirl of regret, resentment, and something far uglier he couldn't yet name. His fingers gripped the edges of a crumpled report, but his eyes stared blankly through it, unable to process a single word. The room around him buzzed faintly with the hum of precinct life, phones ringing, distant voices murmuring, but it all felt miles away, drowned out by the storm raging inside him. Moments earlier, Maya had walked out, her steps deliberate and resolute, her boots clicking against the tiled floor with a rhythm that echoed like a judge's gavel. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate. And the silence she left behind was deafening, a void that screamed louder than any accusation ever could. For Darren, that silence was a mirror, reflecting the brutal truth he'd spent years dodging. He wasn't untouchable. The system he'd twisted to shield himself had finally turned, its gears grinding against him with merciless precision. For Maya, though, this was only the opening act. As she strode down the narrow hallway, her shoulders squared and her jaw set, she felt the fire of purpose burning deep in her chest. The path stretching out before her was daunting, littered with obstacles, resistance, and the kind of entrenched corruption that clung like damp rot to old wood. But she was ready. Justice wasn't some lofty dream to her, not a vague word scribbled in law books or preached from podiums. It was a living, breathing choice, one she'd carved into her soul with every step she took. She'd seen too many Darrens in her time, men who wielded power like a club, who believed the badge made them invincible. And she'd made her vow long ago, she'd be the one to hold the line. To prove that actions had consequences, no matter how high someone climbed or how deep they dug their roots into the system. Back in the precinct, the air crackled with unease as the hours crawled by. Word of the confrontation had spread like wildfire through the ranks, igniting whispers that darted from cubicle to cubicle, officer to officer. The hallways, usually filled with the casual banter of a tight-knit crew, now hummed with hushed tones and stolen glances. Darren remained at his desk, a statue of tension, his back ramrod straight. His face drained of color, his knuckles white where they pressed against the wood. Every so often, his gaze flicked upward, scanning the room as if expecting an ambush. Inside, his thoughts churned violently. He replayed Maya's words over and over, each syllable sharp as a blade, each glance she'd thrown his way laced with a quiet, unyielding fury. She'd stripped him bare in front of everyone, peeled back the armor he'd worn so proudly, and left him exposed. The humiliation seared through him, a white-hot flame that fueled his anger. She was out to destroy him, he told himself. This wasn't justice, it was a vendetta, a calculated move to make him the poster child for her so-called reform. But beneath the rage, something else gnawed at him, a faint, unfamiliar ache he couldn't shake. Was it doubt? Fear? He shoved it down, refusing to let it take root. He was still Darren. Still the man who'd walked these halls like a king, who'd bent the rules and laughed at the complaints piling up in some dusty file cabinet. Yet now, as he sat there, the weight of Maya's accusations pressed against his chest like a slab of concrete, making it hard to breathe. Then came Baker, his shadow falling across Darren's desk like an unwelcome guest. The man's broad frame leaned casually against the edge, but his face betrayed a mix of sympathy and unease. Baker wasn't one for drama, he was steady, practical. The kind of guy who kept his head down and did the job. His brown eyes, framed by faint crow's feet, studied Darren cautiously, as if approaching a wounded animal. "You okay, man?" he asked. His voice low, almost swallowed by the ambient noise of the precinct. He shifted his weight, the creak of his leather belt punctuating the awkward silence. "I mean, that was brutal back there." She didn't hold back. Darren didn't meet his gaze. His jaw tightened until it ached, his teeth grinding together as he muttered, "She's trying to ruin me, Baker. That's all this is. She wants to parade me out like some kind of trophy, and she'll lie through her teeth to do it." The words dripped with venom, each one a dart aimed at Maya's back. He could picture her now, sitting smugly in her office, plotting her next move. It made his blood boil. Baker frowned, his thick brows knitting together as he cast a quick glance around the room, ensuring no one was close enough to overhear. "I don't know, Darren," he said, his tone careful but firm. "She's got evidence, complaints, records, the works. If she's taken this to internal affairs, it's not just gonna fade away like last time." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Baker wasn't naive, he'd seen the cracks in Darren's armor before. The whispered rumors about shortcuts and strong-arm tactics. But he'd always stayed quiet, loyal in the way cops often were to one another. Now, though, there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, doubt. Darren's head snapped up, his glare cutting through Baker like a knife. "You think I don't know how bad this looks?" he snapped, his voice rising before he caught himself and lowered it to a hiss. "She's had it out for me since day one. All this talk about reform, accountability, it's bullshit. It's not about fixing anything. It's about tearing us down, guys like me and you who actually know how this job works." His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles paling as his frustration boiled over. He couldn't stand the thought of Maya winning, of her smug righteousness toppling everything he'd built. Baker raised an eyebrow, his skepticism plain as day. "Or maybe it's about people who've gotten away with too much for too long," he said, his voice steady but edged with a challenge. He crossed his arms, the fabric of his uniform stretching slightly over his shoulders. Baker wasn't a saint, he'd bent a rule or two himself over the years, but he'd never crossed the lines Darren had. There was a difference, he thought, between surviving the job and exploiting it. Darren's eyes narrowed, his tone dropping to a dangerous growl. Careful, Baker. I'm not in the mood for your preaching. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken tension. For a moment, it seemed like Darren might lunge across the desk. But Baker held up his hands in a gesture of peace, though his expression didn't soften. I'm just saying, Baker continued, undeterred, maybe it's time to look at yourself, man. You've been at this a long time. What if she's got a point? He let the question hang there, a quiet bomb ticking between them. Darren scoffed, shaking his head as if he could dismiss the idea entirely. You sound like her, he shot back. You don't get it, Baker. You don't know what it's like out there, the shit we deal with every day. She sits up there in her ivory tower, preaching about fairness, but she's never had to make the calls we do. Baker shrugged, his tone neutral but piercing. Maybe. But from where I'm standing, she seems to understand a lot more than you're willing to admit. The words landed like a punch, and Darren flinched, turning his face away to hide the flicker of uncertainty that crossed it. Baker lingered a moment longer, his boots scuffing the floor as he shifted, then walked off, leaving Darren alone with the echoes of their exchange. Across the precinct, Maya sat in her office. Her focus a steel blade cutting through the chaos. Papers were spread across her desk in meticulous order, complaints, witness statements. Timestamps of Darren's missteps, all of it a map of his downfall she'd spent months piecing together. The confrontation earlier had been the spark, but this was the fire. And she intended to let it burn until every shadow of corruption was exposed. She knew the pushback was coming, she could feel it in the way the officers avoided her eyes in the halls. In the clipped tones of their conversations when she passed. Since the day she'd taken this job, there'd been a quiet rebellion simmering beneath the surface. A resentment toward her refusal to play by the old rules. But Maya hadn't come here to be liked. She'd come to rip out the rot. To prove that justice wasn't a privilege for the powerful but a right for everyone they'd sworn to protect. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. She picked it up. Her eyes softening as she read the message from Carla, her closest ally in this fight. You're doing the right thing. Don't let them wear you down. Carla was a dispatcher. A wiry woman with a quick laugh and a spine of steel, who'd seen too many good officers crushed by the system's weight. Her support was a lifeline, a reminder that Maya wasn't entirely alone. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she set the phone down and returned to her work, her pen scratching notes in the margins of a report. A knock at the door broke her concentration. And she looked up to see Captain Lewis standing there, his tall frame filling the doorway. His gray hair glinted under the fluorescent lights. And his weathered face carried the marks of decades on the force, lines etched deep from hard choices and harder days. Got a minute? He asked. His voice calm but laced with a seriousness that made her sit up straighter. She nodded, gesturing for him to enter, and he shut the door behind him before settling into the chair across from her. There was a wariness in his posture, a guardedness she'd come to recognize. Lewis wasn't her enemy. But he wasn't fully her ally either, he was a man caught between loyalty to his officers and the nagging pull of his own conscience. I've been hearing a lot about today, he began. His words measured, each one chosen with care. You've kicked up quite a storm, Maya. His eyes met hers, searching for something, resolve, perhaps, or a crack he could widen. She held his gaze. Unflinching. Is that a problem? Her tone was sharp, a challenge wrapped in calm. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the desk, her fingers steepled as she waited for his response. Lewis hesitated, rubbing a hand over his jaw as if the motion could ease the tension in the room. Depends on how it plays out, he said finally. You've put Darren under a microscope. And that means the whole department's in the spotlight now. That kind of attention, it's tough to manage. His voice carried a warning, but there was no malice in it. Only the weariness of a man who'd seen too many battles fought and lost. Tough for who? Maya pressed, her eyes narrowing. The officers who've looked the other way? The ones who've let Darren's behavior slide because it was easier than rocking the boat? If that's who we're protecting, then maybe they deserve to squirm. Her words were a blade. Precise and unapologetic, cutting through the haze of excuses she'd heard too many times. Louis sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of his years. I'm not saying you're wrong, he admitted, his tone softening. But you know how this goes, Maya. Change like this, it's a war. People dig in, they fight dirty, and sometimes they take you down with them. He leaned back, his hands resting on his knees, studying her with a mix of concern and grudging respect. I know, she replied, her voice firm as stone. But that doesn't mean we back off. If we let Darren skate, we're telling everyone it's fine to abuse the badge, to trample on the people we're supposed to serve. I won't stand for that. Her conviction filled the room. A tangible force that seemed to push back against the shadows creeping in. Louis watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. A faint spark of admiration breaking through his reserve. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, standing to leave. Just be careful. This kind of fight, it wears you down if you let it. He paused at the door, glancing back. I don't want to see you break before you've had a chance to finish what you started. Maya gave a small nod, acknowledging his words. But her resolve didn't waver. Thank you, Captain. But I'm not stopping. As Louis stepped out, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The road ahead loomed large and treacherous, but she was ready to walk it, step by determined step. Darren's reckoning wasn't just his, it was a lesson. A warning to every officer who thought power came without accountability. And she'd see it through, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, the precinct settled into an eerie quiet, not the calm of resolution, but the taut stillness of a bowstring drawn tight. Darren's absence was a void. His empty desk a silent testament to the storm brewing beneath the surface. The investigation into his actions marched on, each new piece of evidence, complaints from citizens. Reports buried by complicit hands, painting a clearer picture of his reign of arrogance. It wasn't just his clash with Maya in the park, it was years of overreach. Of voices silenced and lives bruised by his unchecked power. The truth was clawing its way out, and when it broke free, there'd be no hiding from it. Officers moved through the halls with quick, furtive glances, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. Maya's presence was a lightning rod, some avoided her, others watched her with a mix of fear and reluctant awe. She carried herself with the same unshakable resolve, her footsteps steady as she navigated the shifting tides of loyalty and resistance. The pressure was mounting. A vice tightening around her with every passing day, but she refused to bend. She knew there were others who believed in her, Carla, a few quiet rookies, even Baker in his own reluctant way. With them at her side, she'd keep pushing, dismantling the old guard brick by brick. Darren, meanwhile, sat in the eye of the hurricane he'd unleashed, blind to the scope of what was coming. His actions had lit the fuse, and the explosion would reshape everything he'd known. Justice wasn't just a consequence, it was a force of change, relentless and inevitable. And as the precinct braced for the fallout, one truth rang clear, the days of silence and complicity were over. The storm was here, and it would leave no one untouched. In the dimly lit corners of the precinct, whispers had begun to spread like wildfire, carried by officers who had long buried their fears beneath layers of silence. For years, they'd watched Darren wield his authority like a blunt instrument, his badge a shield against accountability. Now, with the truth clawing its way to the surface, their reluctance was giving way to a reluctant courage. Maya, seated at her desk that gray March afternoon in 2025, felt the weight of their confessions pressing down on her. She sifted through the latest reports from Internal Affairs, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages as if they might reveal more than just words. The evidence was mounting. A tapestry of misdeeds so intricately woven that it could no longer be ignored. Yet, as she leaned back in her chair, the creak of the leather punctuating the stillness, she knew this was only the beginning. Exposing Darren's actions was a victory, but ensuring it sparked real, lasting change, that was the mountain still left to climb. Justice, she thought, was a fragile thing, easily toppled by those too comfortable in their power. The soft knock at her door broke her reverie. Carla stepped inside, her boots scuffing lightly against the worn linoleum floor. Her face was a mask, unreadable as stone, but there was a slump to her shoulders, a heaviness that seemed to pull the air taut between them. Maya's gaze sharpened, her pulse quickening as she sensed the gravity of the moment. "There's something you need to see," Carla said, her voice low and deliberate. She extended a tablet. Its screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the office. Maya took it, her brow creasing as her thumb brushed the cool glass. Carla had already opened a link, and as Maya tapped it, a video flickered to life. The footage was rough, the edges blurred by the shaky hand of an unseen bystander, but the scene was unmistakable. It was the park. That tense confrontation with Darren she'd replayed in her mind 100 times. Now, here it was, captured in grainy detail for the world to witness. She watched, her breath held tight in her chest. As Darren's voice cut through the static, sharp, biting, dripping with the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked power. "ID, now," he barked, his posture rigid, looming over her like a storm cloud. The camera caught every nuance, the curl of his lip, the flash of irritation in his eyes as she stood her ground. Maya's response came next, steady and unyielding. A quiet defiance that seemed to ripple through the frame. "I'm not obligated to give you that," she said, her voice a calm anchor against his rising tide of frustration. The video ended abruptly, leaving a silence that hummed in her ears. She handed the tablet back to Carla, her face still, though her mind churned like a restless sea. "How long has this been out there?" she asked. Her tone measured but edged with urgency. "Just a few hours," Carla replied, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "But it's spreading fast, people are sharing it, talking about it. It's gone viral already." She paused, her dark eyes searching Maya's face. "There's a lot of support for you out there, but there's pushback too. You know how it goes." Maya nodded, her thoughts spiraling as she absorbed the implications. The video was a beacon, casting light on Darren's behavior in a way no report or testimony ever could. It was raw, undeniable. A window into the truth she'd fought so hard to uncover. But it was also a spotlight, one that now blazed down on her, illuminating her every move. She could already hear the whispers of those who'd twist it, call her a rabble-rouser, a climber using this to scale the ranks. The stakes had just soared higher than she'd ever imagined. "Has Darren seen it?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. Carla hesitated, her fingers tightening around the tablet. "I don't know for sure," she admitted, "but I'd bet he has. Stuff like this, it travels like lightning." Maya sighed, sinking deeper into her chair, the fabric groaning beneath her. "This is going to make things messy, she murmured. More to herself than to Carla. "Maybe," Carla said, her tone softening but steady as a rock. "But it's out there now, Maya. People are seeing what really happened. That's not nothing." Maya gave a small nod, though her mind was a whirlwind of possibilities. The truth was free, unshackled from the shadows of the precinct, but with it came a burden she hadn't fully braced for. Every step she took now would be watched, dissected, judged. There was no room for error, not if she wanted justice to mean something more than a fleeting headline. Across town. Darren sat in the dim glow of his living room, the curtains drawn tight against the encroaching dusk. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the coffee table. A swarm of notifications lighting up the screen, texts, emails, tags and posts he didn't dare open. He'd seen the video, stumbled across it while scrolling in a haze of disbelief. The sight of himself on that shaky footage, his own voice barking orders, his own hands gesturing with that familiar authority, had sent a chill racing down his spine. This wasn't just another complaint filed away in some dusty internal affairs folder. This was public, raw, a spectacle for strangers to gawk at and judge. He paced the room. His socked feet wearing a path into the rug, his chest tight with a cocktail of dread and fury. For years, he'd believed himself invincible, his rank and reputation a fortress no one could breach. Now, that fortress was crumbling, brick by brick, and he could feel the cold wind of consequence seeping through the cracks. A sharp rap at the door jolted him from his spiral. He froze. His hand hovering over the knob before he pulled it open. Baker stood there, his broad frame filling the porch, his face etched with a grimness that made Darren's stomach twist. The man's hands were buried deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a storm. "Mind if I come in?" Baker asked, his voice rough but quiet. Darren stepped aside wordlessly. The air between them thick with unspoken tension. They settled into the living room, the silence stretching taut until Baker finally broke it. "I saw the video," he said, his words heavy as lead. "It's bad, Darren. Real bad." Darren's scoff was sharp, a burst of frustration he couldn't contain. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't been drowning in it all day?" His voice cracked, betraying the panic simmering beneath his bravado. Baker held up a hand, his expression steady but not unkind. "I'm not here to pile on," he said. "But you've got to face this. It's not going away, not with how big it's gotten. The department can't bury this one, not anymore." Darren's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing as he snapped, "What do you want me to do, huh? Crawl to her on my knees? Beg her to let it go? She's had it out for me from the start." Baker didn't flinch, though his gaze softened slightly. "Maybe she has," he conceded. "But you've still got a choice here. You can dig in, keep pretending none of this is on you, and see how far that gets you. Or you can own it, take some damn responsibility and try to save what's left." Darren stared at him, his breath shallow, his mind a battlefield of pride and fear. Admitting he was wrong, that he'd abused the power he'd clung to so fiercely, it felt like swallowing glass. But Baker's words gnawed at him, a quiet truth he couldn't outrun. The walls were closing in, and time was slipping through his fingers. Back at the precinct, Maya sat hunched over her desk. The glow of her lamp casting long shadows across the room. The video had shifted the ground beneath her feet, but it hadn't shaken her resolve, it had forged it into something harder, sharper. She knew the path ahead would be treacherous, lined with skeptics and loyalists who'd rather see her fall than Darren face the music. But as she pored over the final details of the investigation, her pen scratching notes in the margins, she felt a flicker of something like hope. The truth was out there now, a torch in the darkness. And with it came a chance to reshape the department into something better, something just. Her thoughts drifted to Darren, to the man behind the bluster. Did he feel the weight of this yet? Could he see the fault lines in the empire he'd built? She didn't know if redemption was in him, but for his sake, and for the sake of everyone watching, she hoped he'd at least try. The fallout was just beginning, a storm gathering on the horizon, and its echoes would stretch far beyond these walls. The precinct itself buzzed with a nervous energy, a hive stirred into chaos. Officers moved with deliberate caution, their footsteps soft against the tiled floors, their conversations hushed as if the building itself might overhear. Darren's absence hung like a ghost. An empty space that unsettled more than it soothed. The video had ripped open old wounds and sparked new debates, some heated, some introspective, among those who'd long turned a blind eye. For Maya, it wasn't just about the uproar or the scrutiny. It was about the shift she felt in the air, the way people were finally looking, even if they didn't want to. She met with Captain Lewis later that day, the two of them seated across from each other in his cramped office. His desk was cluttered with files. A thick folder from Internal Affairs resting between them like a loaded gun. Lewis leaned forward, his elbows on the wood, his brow furrowed deep with lines of worry and resolve. "We've got it all here," he said, tapping the folder with a calloused finger. "Witnesses, statements, years of this crap piling up. It's enough to end him, termination, maybe more." His voice was low, a rumble of certainty tinged with unease. Maya folded her hands on the desk, her posture steady, though her mind churned with the weight of what came next. "Then we do it right," she said, her words firm but thoughtful. "No backroom deals, no quiet slaps on the wrist. If we don't show everyone we mean it, if we don't hold him accountable where they can see it, we're just propping up the same rotten system." Lewis nodded slowly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "You're not wrong," he admitted, "but this is going to kick up a hell of a mess. Darren's got people, friends, old-timers who'll call this a lynching. Say we're out for blood. Let them," Maya shot back, her voice cutting like a blade. "This isn't about settling scores or playing games. It's about what's right, what this place is supposed to stand for. If they can't see that, maybe they're part of what's broken." Lewis studied her, his gaze lingering as if measuring the steel in her spine. After a long beat, he leaned back, a faint, weary smile tugging at his lips. "You've got fire, Deputy Chief. I'll give you that. Just brace yourself, this won't be tidy." Maya nodded, her expression unwavering. She'd known the risks from the moment she'd taken up this fight. Justice wasn't a clean blade, it was a hammer. Heavy and unyielding, and wielding it meant accepting the chaos it would unleash. But as she left Lewis's office, the folder tucked under her arm, she felt the weight of something greater than herself, a lesson carved in the wreckage: power unchecked was a poison, and only accountability could draw it out. The battle was far from won. But she was ready for the war. The decision to follow through with this path wasn't one she'd made lightly. For her, the road to holding people accountable stretched out like a treacherous, winding trail, rugged, steep, and unforgiving. Yet, she knew it was a journey she couldn't abandon, no matter how exhausting it became. She stood resolute, her determination a quiet fire burning deep within her chest, fueled by years of watching power twist and corrupt those who wielded it unchecked. There was no turning back now. Not when the stakes were this high, not when justice hung in the balance, fragile and fleeting. Meanwhile, Darren lingered in his car, parked just beyond the precinct's looming shadow. The engine had gone silent long ago, but he couldn't muster the courage to step inside. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles widening as he stared through the grimy windshield at the world beyond. Inside that building, he knew what awaited him: the sidelong glances, the hushed murmurs that would trail him like a shadow, the unspoken judgment heavy in every pair of eyes. He couldn't face it, not yet. His mind churned, a stormy sea of emotions crashing against one another: anger at being cornered, regret for the choices that had led him here, and something murkier, a feeling he couldn't pin down. It gnawed at him, restless and undefined, as the weight of his past decisions settled over him like a lead blanket. For years, he'd moved through life shrugging off the fallout of his actions, believing himself untouchable. Now, that illusion was crumbling, and he felt exposed, raw, and utterly lost. The sudden buzz of his phone jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. It vibrated insistently on the passenger seat, a lifeline he wasn't sure he wanted to grasp. With a reluctant glance, he saw the name on the screen, Baker. The message was curt. Cutting through the fog of his indecision like a blade. "You need to talk to her now." Darren let out a sharp, shaky breath, dragging a hand across his stubbled jaw. Baker was right, he always was. Damn him. This wasn't something Darren could sidestep, no matter how desperately he wanted to crawl away and hide. If he didn't confront it head-on, it would swallow him whole, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. His chest tightened as he picked up the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before he dialed a number he'd never thought he'd need. The line rang once, twice, and then her voice came through, calm, steady, but laced with a faint edge of surprise. "This is Deputy Chief Williams," she said, her tone professional yet guarded. "It's Darren," he replied, his voice taut, strained by the effort of keeping it steady. "I need to talk to you." There was a pause, a heartbeat of silence that stretched into eternity. Darren could almost picture her on the other end, weighing his words, her sharp mind dissecting his intentions. When she spoke again, her response was measured, deliberate. "I'll be in my office for the next hour. If you're serious about this, come find me." The line clicked dead before he could say anything more, leaving him alone with the thudding of his own heart. He sat there, frozen, the phone still warm in his hand. Was he ready for this? He didn't know, couldn't know, but readiness didn't matter anymore. He had no choice. With a deep, shuddering breath, he pushed open the car door and stepped out into the cool evening air. Each step toward the precinct felt like wading through molasses, his boots dragging against the asphalt as if his body itself resisted what lay ahead. When he reached her office, he hesitated at the threshold, his fist hovering over the door. A soft knock, barely audible, was all he could manage before he turned the knob and stepped inside. Maya looked up from her desk, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his stomach twist. Papers were scattered across her workspace, a testament to the endless demands of her role, but her posture remained composed, almost regal. She gestured for him to enter with a slight tilt of her head, and he closed the door behind him, the click of the latch sounding louder than it should have in the stillness. The silence between them grew thick, a vast chasm that neither seemed eager to cross. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up," Maya said at last, her voice even but carrying a subtle weight. As if she were testing him. "Neither was I," Darren admitted, his words low and rough, scraped from somewhere deep inside. He shifted uncomfortably, searching for the right thing to say. But everything felt inadequate. "I saw the video," he began, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Anne. I get it." The admission stuck in his throat, heavy and bitter. "I get why you're doing this. Why you're coming after me. But you have to understand, it wasn't personal." Maya's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something sharp passing through them, disbelief, perhaps, or restrained anger. When she spoke, her voice cut through the air like a whip. "Not personal. You humiliated me in front of strangers, Darren. You made snap judgments about me based on nothing but the color of my skin. And you're standing there telling me it wasn't personal? Everything about what you did was personal." Her words landed like blows, each one striking at the fragile armor he'd built around himself. He flinched, his jaw clenching as the truth of her accusation sank in, deep and unrelenting. "I screwed up," he said, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. "I know that. I've screwed up a lot of things over the years, more than I can count. I didn't see it before, didn't want to see it, but I do now." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the turmoil churning beneath his gruff exterior. He risked a glance at her, hoping for some sign of softening, but Maya's expression remained unreadable, her gaze steady and piercing. "Do you?" she asked, leaning forward slightly, her hands resting on the desk. "Because seeing it isn't enough, Darren. Acknowledging it isn't enough. You've spent years abusing your position. Turning a blind eye to the consequences of your actions. Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused, not just to me, but to the people you were supposed to serve? To this department?" Her voice rose, not in volume but in intensity, each syllable laced with a quiet fury that made the air feel electric. Darren swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. I didn't think it mattered," he confessed, the words tasting like ash. "I thought I was doing what needed to be done, what had to be done." "What had to be done?" Maya echoed. Her tone incredulous, almost mocking. "Harassing innocent people? Throwing your authority around like it's a weapon? Tell me, Darren, when did any of that ever need to be done?" Her question hung in the air, sharp and unanswerable, and the silence that followed was suffocating. He had no rebuttal, no justification to offer. All he could do was sit there, shoulders slumped. As the full scope of his failures pressed down on him like a physical force. For so long, he'd convinced himself that his actions were necessary, that the ends justified the means. Now, stripped bare by her words, he saw the lie for what it was. Maya leaned back in her chair, her gaze never wavering. "I don't know if you can fix this, Darren," she said. Her voice softening slightly but still firm. "I don't even know if you want to. But if you're serious about trying, it starts with taking responsibility. No more excuses, no more dodging the truth. Own what you've done, and maybe, you'll find a way to make things right." He nodded slowly, the motion almost involuntary. "I'll try," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Fragile in the vastness of the room. "Trying isn't enough," Maya shot back, her tone resolute. "But it's a start. Now get out of my office. You've got a long road ahead, and I've got work to do." Darren rose to his feet, the weight in his chest heavier than ever. As he turned to leave, though, something flickered within him, a faint, tentative spark of hope. It was small, delicate. Easily snuffed out, but it was there. He stepped back into the precinct's dimly lit halls, the air thick with an unusual quiet. The usual bustle had faded, replaced by a palpable tension that seemed to cling to the walls. His conversation with Maya had rattled him to his core, her words echoing in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. Sitting in his car again, staring blankly at the steering wheel, he replayed every moment of their exchange. Her directness had caught him off guard. Her unwavering resolve cutting through his defenses like a blade. And yet, beneath the sting of her accusations, he couldn't deny the truth she'd laid bare. Trying wasn't enough, not unless it led to something real, something lasting. Inside the precinct, Maya lingered at her desk long after the others had gone home. The surface was buried beneath a chaotic sprawl of reports, handwritten notes, and case files, each one a piece of the endless puzzle she'd dedicated herself to solving. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, a constant companion she'd grown accustomed to carrying. The video, video, had ignited a firestorm. Its reach extending far beyond the precinct's walls. It had sparked heated discussions in the community, drawn the attention of local leaders who offered their support. And roused the voices of those demanding more action, more accountability, more justice. Maya welcomed the scrutiny, even as it piled new challenges onto her already overflowing plate. Every step forward felt like pushing against a tide, every victory shadowed by fresh doubts and questions about her choices. A soft knock at the door broke her focus, and she looked up to see Carla, her longtime friend and confidant, stepping into the room. Carla's face was a mixture of worry and curiosity as she set a steaming cup of coffee on the desk. the rich aroma cutting through the stale air. She lingered for a moment, hesitant, before speaking. "I saw Darren leave earlier," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "He looked different. What happened?" Maya leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as exhaustion tugged at her. "He came to talk," she said with a tired sigh. "I think he's starting to see the mess he's made, how deep it goes. But whether that turns into real change or just another round of empty promises, I can't say." Carla nodded thoughtfully, pulling up a chair and settling in across from her. "Do you think he meant it? Whatever he said?" Maya paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug as she considered the question. "I think he's scared," she said finally. "Scared of losing everything he's built, scared of being seen for what he really is. But fear doesn't change a person, not on its own. He's got to face the consequences, and he's got to want to do better, not just because he's backed into a corner, but because it's right." Her voice grew firm, underscored by a quiet conviction that had carried her through years of battles like this one. Carla sipped her coffee, her gaze distant yet thoughtful. "Do you think people like him can really change?" she asked, her tone soft but heavy with the weight of the question. "I don't know," Maya admitted, her honesty raw and unguarded. "But I have to believe it's possible. If I don't, then what's the point of fighting for any of this?" The words hung between them, a shared truth that bound them in the silence that followed. After a moment, Carla stood, offering a small, encouraging smile. "You're doing the right thing, Maya, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." As Carla slipped out, Maya turned back to the reports before her, the faint glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. She'd spent years waging wars like this, against corruption, against apathy, against the slow grind of a system resistant to change. Each fight left its mark, etching lines of weariness into her face, but she refused to let it break her spirit. This wasn't just about Darren or the precinct, it was about something bigger, a vision of a world where accountability wasn't a hollow promise but a cornerstone of justice. She knew that dream wouldn't come to life overnight, but she'd be damned if she didn't keep pushing for it. Across town, Darren sat alone in the dim light of his cramped apartment, the silence around him oppressive and thick. The television flickered in the background, its muted chatter a meaningless hum he barely registered. His phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table, a growing pile of notifications lighting up the screen, texts from colleagues, old friends, even strangers who'd seen the video and felt compelled to weigh in. He hadn't dared open social media since it all began, couldn't stomach the thought of facing the flood of outrage and condemnation waiting for him there. Instead, he sat motionless, staring into the void, the echoes of Maya's words still ringing in his ears. The lesson was sinking in, slow and painful: power, when abused, didn't just harm others, it eroded the soul of the one who held it. And now, for the first time, he wondered if there was a way back from the edge, or if he'd already fallen too far. The air in Darren Mitchell's small apartment felt thick, almost suffocating, as he sat motionless on the worn-out couch. He didn't need to glance at his phone or turn on the television to know what awaited him beyond those four walls: a relentless storm of condemnation, a chorus of voices dissecting his every mistake. He could feel their words pressing against him like a physical weight, accusing, judging, tearing apart not just his actions but the very person he'd become. In their eyes, he wasn't merely Darren, the man who'd stumbled; he was a living emblem of everything broken, a testament to a system that had let his failures fester unchecked for far too long. The thought gnawed at him, a bitter ache that settled deep in his chest, mingling with shame and a restless unease he couldn't shake. A sharp knock at the door sliced through the silence, jolting him upright. His heart thudded against his ribs, and for a moment, he froze, his hand hovering over the armrest. Who could it be now? Another reporter? A furious neighbor? He dragged himself to his feet, each step heavy with reluctance, and cracked the door open just enough to see. To his astonishment, it was Baker, his old colleague, the one man who seemed incapable of leaving well enough alone. Baker's face was a mask, impossible to read, his eyes shadowed under the dim hallway light. Without a word, he brushed past Darren, stepping into the apartment as if he owned the place. Darren shut the door with a soft click, irritation flaring in his gut, though beneath it flickered a reluctant gratitude. Baker had always been stubborn, but this? This was something else. "You're digging yourself deeper, you know that, right?" Baker's voice cut through the room, steady and matter-of-fact. He crossed his arms. Leaning casually against the peeling wallpaper near the kitchen doorway, his posture relaxed yet commanding. Darren sank back onto the couch, his frown deepening as he rubbed his temples. "What do you expect me to do, Baker?" he snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. "Walk out there, plaster a smile on my face, and pretend none of this happened? It's not that simple." Baker didn't flinch. "No, it's not simple," he agreed, his voice calm but unyielding. "And sitting here drowning in self-pity isn't going to magically fix it either. You've got an opportunity here, Darren, a real shot to do something meaningful. Don't throw it away." His words hung in the air, heavy with expectation, and Darren felt his frustration boil over. He raked a hand through his messy hair, his fingers trembling slightly. "Do what, exactly?" he shot back, his voice rising. "Go grovel in front of everyone? Beg for forgiveness and hope that erases everything? It's too late for that." Baker's gaze hardened, but his tone remained firm, almost gentle in its resolve. "It's not about erasing anything. It's about facing what you've done, looking the people you've hurt square in the eye and owning it. You can't rewrite the past, Darren. But you can damn well decide who you're going to be from here on out." The words landed like a punch, and Darren's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to shove Baker's sanctimonious advice right back in his face, but something stopped him. Deep down, buried beneath layers of denial and defensiveness, a quiet truth stirred. For years, he'd built a fortress of excuses, telling himself he'd acted for the greater good, that the ends justified the means. Now, stripped bare by the glaring light of reality, those justifications crumbled like dry leaves. The realization stung, a raw, searing pain that clawed at his insides, but there was no running from it anymore. The next morning, the precinct loomed before him like a fortress of judgment, its gray walls stark against the pale dawn sky. Darren arrived earlier than anyone, the weight of his decision pressing down on his shoulders like a yoke. His footsteps echoed in the empty halls, each one a reminder of what he was about to do. There was fear. Yes, a nervous energy that pulsed through his veins, but also a strange, fragile clarity, like the first light breaking through a storm. As he passed the bullpen, the chatter of early shift officers died down, their eyes tracking him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. He kept his head down, his pulse hammering, until he reached Maya's office. She looked up from her desk as he knocked, her expression as unreadable as stone, though her dark eyes flickered with something, wariness, perhaps, or cautious interest. He stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing him into this moment. "I need to say something," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Maya gestured to the chair across from her. Her gaze locked on him, sharp and unwavering. "I'm listening," she said simply, her tone giving nothing away. Darren sat, his fists clenching in his lap as he drew a deep breath, the air catching in his throat. "I've screwed up, Maya. More times than I can count. I can't take back what I've done, God knows I wish I could, but I want to make it right. I don't even know where to begin, but I know it starts with me owning up to it." His words spilled out, raw and unpolished, each one carrying the weight of years spent hiding from himself. Maya leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk, her expression softening just enough to reveal a hint of something human beneath her steel exterior. "Why now, Darren?" she asked. Her voice low and searching. "What's different today?" He faltered, his mind racing for an answer that felt true. "I've spent so long trying to convince myself I had it all under control," he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. "I told myself I was doing the right thing, that I knew best. But I never stopped to see the people I was crushing underfoot. Now it's all right there in front of me, and I can't look away anymore." His chest tightened as he spoke, the confession peeling back layers he'd fought to keep buried. Maya studied him, her piercing gaze cutting through his defenses like a blade. "This isn't going to be a walk in the park," she warned, her tone firm but not unkind. "Facing what you've done means facing everything that comes with it, every consequence, every judgment. Are you ready for that?" Darren swallowed hard, the question sinking into him like a stone. "I don't think I'll ever be ready," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know it's the only path I've got left." She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she considered him. "Then we start there," she said at last. "But hear me clearly, Darren, this isn't about redemption. It's about accountability. If you mean this, you've got to put in the work, no matter how brutal it gets." Her words were a lifeline and a challenge all at once, and as he met her eyes, he felt the gravity of them settle into his bones. "I understand," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. Leaving her office, Darren felt the air shift around him, a strange blend of finality and faint possibility. The precinct hummed with its usual chaos, but it seemed distant now. Like a world he was no longer fully part of. For him, this was the start of something uncharted, a journey that would test him in ways he couldn't yet fathom. For Maya, it was a quiet affirmation of why she'd chosen this life, to carve out a reality where justice wasn't just a dream but a tangible force, where those who wielded power couldn't escape its shadow. Months later, the precinct bore the scars of change. The investigation into Darren had unraveled like a slow, deliberate thread, pulling apart the fabric of what had once been. Maya had insisted on transparency, laying bare every detail for the public to see, every misstep, every violation, every failure of oversight. The consequences were swift and unyielding. Darren's termination was a quiet affair, held in a sterile meeting room with only internal affairs and Maya present. He handed over his badge and gun, his hands steady but his eyes hollow. The clink of metal against the table echoing in the silence. There were no theatrics, no defiant outbursts, just a man standing face to face with the wreckage he'd left behind. Outside those walls, the world he'd known slipped away, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. At first, Darren fought the tide. Anger consumed him, a bitter fire that flared at the loss of his career, his identity. Everything he'd clung to. He'd pace his apartment at night, the shadows stretching long and accusing across the floor, his mind replaying Maya's words like a broken record, accountability. Not redemption. Slowly, painfully, those words began to take root. He started small, volunteering at a community center downtown, a cramped building with flickering lights and scuffed floors. There, he met kids with wary eyes and guarded voices, teenagers who'd seen too much, who reminded him uncomfortably of the lives he'd ignored in his pursuit of control. He listened to them, really listened. Their stories cutting through the armor he'd worn for years. He saw himself in their anger, their distrust, and it humbled him in a way he hadn't expected. The work didn't erase his past. But it gave him a flicker of purpose, a fragile thread to hold on to. Back at the precinct, Maya's resolve reshaped the landscape. Resistance met her at every turn, grumbling officers, skeptical higher-ups, but she pressed forward, fueled by a vision of what could be. The public's outrage, sparked by the leaked video of Darren's actions, had lit a fire that wouldn't die. She rolled out new training, hours spent on de-escalation tactics, on building bridges with the community instead of walls. Stricter rules for misconduct complaints followed. Each policy a brick in the foundation she was laying. It wasn't fast or easy, change never was. But bit by bit, the officers began to see it. Accountability wasn't a shackle, it was a strength. Trust, so fragile after years of betrayal, started to mend, one honest conversation at a time. Maya's life outside the precinct found its own rhythm too. She carved out evenings with her son, Jordan. A lanky 12-year-old with her sharp eyes and a quiet pride in his mother. They'd sit on their sagging porch, the sky bruising purple above them, talking about his science projects or his wild dreams of building robots. She'd weave lessons into those talks, about doing what's right even when it's hard, about the slow, messy work of making a better world. To Jordan, she was more than a cop or a boss, she was a force, a hero who didn't bend. Those moments grounded her, a reminder of why she fought. One crisp afternoon, months after the dust had settled, a letter arrived on Maya's desk. The envelope was plain, the handwriting shaky. And her breath caught when she saw Darren's name scrawled in the corner. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the paper, then tore it open. His words spilled across the page, uneven and unguarded. He thanked her, not for sparing him, but for holding up a mirror he couldn't ignore. He wrote about the kids at the center, how their resilience chipped away at the walls he'd built. How he was trying, day by day, to be something more than his mistakes. He didn't beg for absolution, only asked that she see his effort. When she finished, Maya leaned back in her chair, the letter resting in her hands. No smile crossed her lips, but a quiet peace settled over her. Darren's fall had been a lesson in justice. A stark reminder that power unchecked breeds ruin, but his tentative steps forward hinted at something else, the possibility of repair, however imperfect. Beyond the precinct, the ripples spread wide. Community leaders rallied, their voices rising in chorus with activists and ordinary folks who'd watched Maya's stand unfold. The city buzzed with demands for reform, inspired by the slow, steady change she'd sparked. The conversation didn't fade, it grew, a living thing fueled by hope and hard-earned clarity. For Maya, it was validation, for Darren, it was a mirror. And for everyone else, it was a call, to build a world where justice wasn't a luxury, but a promise kept. The night stretched endlessly over the quiet highway in Birmingham, Alabama, where the hum of tires against asphalt blended with the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. It was late, far too late for most to be out unless urgency compelled them. A sleek black SUV sliced through the stillness, its driver, a black man in his late 30s, gripping the wheel with steady hands. His sharp eyes flicked to the rearview mirror now and then. A habit born of years navigating roads less forgiving than this one. He'd been stopped before, questioned under the glare of flashlights, scrutinized for no reason other than the color of his skin. It was routine, he told himself, swallowing the familiar bitterness that rose in his throat. Stay calm. Stay steady. But tonight, something lingered in the air, an unease he couldn't shake. Then came the flashing lights. A police cruiser materialized behind him, its siren letting out a single, piercing wail before falling silent, a warning wrapped in menace. His chest tightened as he exhaled slowly, signaling his intent to pull over. The SUV eased onto the shoulder with precision, every move deliberate, textbook perfect. He wasn't about to give them an excuse. Inside the cruiser, Officers Clayton and Reynolds exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken intent. He fits the description, Reynolds muttered, his hand already drifting to his radio, fingers twitching with anticipation. Clayton's lips curled into a smirk, a predator's gleam in his eyes. Doesn't matter. Let's see what we can dig up. They stepped out, their boots crunching against the gravel, moving with the slow, calculated swagger of men who knew the power they wielded. Clayton tapped his flashlight against his palm. A rhythmic thud that echoed in the thick night air, before aiming its blinding beam at the driver's window. The man inside didn't flinch. He rolled the glass down with a smooth motion. Keeping both hands planted firmly on the wheel, his posture a silent declaration of control. "Evening, officers," he said, his voice low and even. "What's the problem?" Clayton leaned in. His shadow spilling into the car, his tone flat but his eyes alight with suspicion. "License and registration." The man nodded, his movements deliberate as he reached for the glove compartment. "Mind if I go slow?" he asked, a faint edge of defiance beneath his calm. Reynolds cut in, hand resting on his holster, fingers flexing. "Just do it." The SUV's interior light blinked on, casting a soft glow over the man's steady hands as he retrieved his documents and handed them over without a word. Clayton studied the license, his thumb brushing over the edge as if testing its authenticity. "Where you headed this late?" The man met his gaze, unflinching. "Home." Reynolds swung his flashlight across the passenger seat. Then the back, its beam slicing through the shadows. "Driving kind of fast back there," he said, his voice dripping with accusation. It was a lie. The man had been right at the speed limit, he knew it. And they knew it too. But he didn't argue. He watched them, his silence a shield, his mind already turning over the pieces of this encounter. Clayton stepped back, clicking his tongue against his teeth. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" For the first time, the man's eyes shifted, just a flicker of something sharp and assessing. "Is there a reason for that?" Reynolds' hand tightened on his holster, his voice hardening. "You resisting?" The man sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. He'd walked this tightrope before, but tonight. The ground beneath him felt unsteady in a way he couldn't yet name. The air outside was thick, humid, the kind that pressed against your skin and made every breath feel labored. He stepped out of the SUV, his movements slow and deliberate, hands visible at his sides, shoulders squared against the weight of their stares. He'd faced worse than this, far worse, and he whispered to himself to breathe, to stay grounded. Clayton circled him, his boots scuffing the gravel. His flashlight now dangling at his side as he sized the man up like a hunter eyeing a trapped animal. Reynolds lingered by the open driver's door, his eyes darting over the interior, searching for anything he could twist into evidence. "Got anything illegal in there?" Clayton asked, his voice laced with a mockery of politeness. "No," the man replied, calm but firm. His pulse steadied despite the storm brewing inside him. "You sure?" Reynolds chuckled under his breath, a sound that grated against the silence. "Mind if we take a look?" There it was, the trap snapping shut. The man knew the game all too well. Refuse, and they'd invent a reason to escalate. Agree, and they'd conjure something out of thin air. "I don't consent to searches," he said, his tone even, his eyes locked on Clayton's. The officer clicked his tongue again, a habit that betrayed his growing impatience. "See, that's interesting. 'Cause we've got probable cause." Reynolds leaned into the car, his broad frame blocking the man's view. But the man caught it, the subtle jerk of Reynolds' arm. The way his elbow shifted as if slipping something into place. When Reynolds pulled back, he held a small bag of white powder between his fingers, his face lighting up with a triumphant grin. Well, what do we have here?" The man stared at the bag, then at them, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with a cold, searing rage that crystallized every detail of this moment. He knew exactly what they'd done, and they had no idea who they'd just crossed. Clayton's grin widened, a predator savoring the kill. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little problem." Reynolds snapped the cuffs on, wrenching them tight, too tight, until the metal bit into the man's wrists. You have the right to remain silent, he began, but the words carried no weight. Just a hollow recitation tinged with amusement. The man clenched his jaw as they shoved him against the hood of his SUV, the cool metal pressing into his chest. Years of training surged through him. He could disarm them both in a heartbeat, leave them sprawled in the dirt before they even realized what hit them. But he held back. Not yet. Not now. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, Reynolds droned on, the planted bag dangling in his hand like a trophy. The man's mind sharpened, already plotting his next move. Because these two fools didn't know the truth, he wasn't just some nobody they could bury under lies. They'd just ignited a fire they couldn't hope to contain. The cuffs dug deeper as they muscled him into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed like a judge's gavel. He sat motionless, staring straight ahead. His face a mask of unreadable calm. Control was his weapon now, control over his body, his emotions, the instincts screaming for release. Outside, Clayton and Reynolds shared a quiet laugh. Their voices muffled but smug. Guy thought he was slick, Reynolds said, leaning against the cruiser, shaking his head. Clayton snorted, kicking at the gravel. Yeah, well. He's about to learn how things work around here. They thought they'd won, another routine stop, another black man they could silence, another case that would vanish into the system's shadows. They were dead wrong. As the car pulled away, the city unfolded beyond the window, neon signs flickering against the glass, casting fleeting streaks of color across his face. He could end this with one phone call, dismantle their entire operation with a single word. But he didn't. Not yet. He needed to see how far this corruption stretched. How many lives it had already claimed. For now, he'd play their game, where the role they'd forced on him, let them think they held the power. At the station. The process was a blur, fingerprints smudging ink onto paper, the flash of a mugshot camera blinding him for a split second. Full name, the officer at the desk barked. Barely glancing up from his clipboard. The man hesitated, the weight of his next move settling over him. He could lie, toss out a fake name and buy himself time. But something told him the truth would hit harder when the moment came. Meanwhile, beyond the station's grimy walls, Maya pressed forward, her voice rising amid a chorus of others demanding change. She didn't see herself as a hero, just one thread in a tapestry far larger than any single soul. That, to her, was the heartbeat of it all, a collective strength, a shared fight for something enduring. Darren, on the other hand, had retreated into a quieter life, the chaos of his past a heavy load he'd learned to shoulder without breaking. He wasn't the man he'd once dreamed of being. And that truth still stung, but he'd made peace with it. Redemption wasn't a finish line, it was a daily grind, a promise he renewed with every sunrise. And that was enough. The lesson here stretched beyond one man's fall or another's rise. It was a mirror held up to justice itself, a stark reminder of how power, when twisted, could crush the innocent and prop up the guilty. Clayton and Reynolds thought they'd mastered the system, bending it to their will with a smirk and a planted bag. But the man in the back of that squad car, he was no ordinary target. He was CIA, a shadow trained to unravel operations far darker than theirs. The truth he carried wasn't just his weapon. It was a reckoning, poised to shatter the fragile empire they'd built on lies. Every choice they'd made that night, every abuse of their badge, was a step closer to their own undoing. Justice, it seemed, had a way of circling back, patient and unrelenting, to claim those who thought themselves untouchable. In the dim flicker of a street lamp, he stood motionless. The cold night air biting at his skin as the officer's flashlight swept over his face. His mind churned, a storm of calculations and buried instincts. He could give his name, his real one, but the thought stopped him cold. If they ran it, alerts would blaze to life in shadowed corners of the world these small-town cops couldn't even fathom. Hidden databases would hum, encrypted lines would crackle, and men in suits far above this dusty precinct would turn their eyes his way. So he stayed silent, lips pressed tight, offering nothing but the faintest twitch of defiance. The officer let out a weary sigh, his breath fogging in the chill, and turned to his partner, Clayton, with a shrug. "No ID," he muttered, voice flat with exhaustion. Clayton, broad-shouldered and perpetually unimpressed, glanced at the man and rolled his eyes. "Guy refused to give us anything," he said, the lie slipping out as easily as breathing. It was a lazy fabrication, barely stitched together, but in a system rigged to trust their word over someone like him, a man with no wallet, no story, no apparent worth. It didn't need to be clever. Truth was a luxury they didn't bother with. They hauled him to the station, the gravel crunching under their boots, and tossed him into a holding cell. The heavy steel door groaned as it swung shut, the clang reverberating through the concrete walls like a judge's gavel. Inside, the air was thick with stale sweat and despair. Men slouched against the grimy walls, their shoulders sagging under the weight of time. Some stared blankly at the cracked floor, their eyes hollow, as if they'd been there for hours, others, days. Their spirits worn thin like old fabric. A younger guy, barely out of his teens, sat hunched in the corner, his tired gaze flicking up to meet the newcomers. Shadows clung to the hollows of his face. His voice a rasp as he asked, "What did they get you for?" The man exhaled slowly, a plume of breath curling into the dank air. "Doesn't matter," he said, his tone low and steady, masking the fire simmering beneath. "Because come morning, this whole station would be a house of cards in a hurricane." Tonight, though, the officers slept soundly in their arrogance, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond their grasp. The courtroom buzzed like a hive, packed tight with bodies and anticipation. Reporters crammed the benches, their notebooks poised. Cameras flashing in staccato bursts, microphones thrust forward like spears. A case like this, a routine drug bust, or so it seemed, rarely drew such a crowd. But something about it had ignited a spark. A whisper of something bigger, and now the flames were licking at the edges of the room. The prosecution stood tall, exuding confidence as sharp as their tailored suits. The district attorney, a man who'd clawed his way up on a ladder of harsh sentences and polished soundbites, adjusted his tie with a smirk. To him, this was a formality, a victory already etched in stone. Across the room, the accused sat at the defense table, wrists unshackled now but his posture rigid, a coiled spring held in check. His eyes, dark and unreadable, betrayed nothing, no fear, no flicker of doubt. Behind him, a few rows back, Clayton and Reynolds lounged with arms crossed, their sharp gazes softened by a smug certainty. They looked like men who'd already won, who believed the game was theirs to play. The judge swept in, robe billowing like a thundercloud, and the jury shuffled to their seats, a mix of nervous glances and stiff spines. The trial kicked off with the prosecution charging forward, their narrative polished to a sheen. The DA's voice rang out, steady and commanding, as he wove a tale of law and order, of diligent officers purging the streets of poison. These men did their duty, he declared, gesturing toward Clayton and Reynolds with a flourish. Then he turned, pointing at the accused with the disdain of a man swatting a fly. "And now he wants you to see him as the victim." The jury leaned in, some nodding faintly, their faces a blank slate. The evidence came next, a plastic bag of white powder, officer reports so uniform they might have been stamped from the same mold, and a convenient excuse about missing body cam footage. "Technical malfunction," the DA said with a shrug, brushing it off as the crowd murmured briefly before settling. He pressed on, detailing the arrest, the contraband, the man's stubborn silence at the station. Victory gleamed in his eyes, he thought he'd nailed it shut. Then the defense rose. She was tall, her presence a quiet force that filled the room without effort. No theatrics, no rush, just a calm that seemed to still the air itself. She let the silence stretch, her gaze sweeping the jury with piercing clarity. "Do you believe in coincidences?" she asked, her voice soft but cutting. The DA's brow creased, a shadow of unease flitting across his face. She turned, nodding toward Clayton and Reynolds with a smile that held no kindness. "Because these men are counting on you too." The room tensed, a wire pulled taut. Something was shifting. A crack forming in the foundation, and no one, not the judge, not the jury, not the smug officers, was ready for what came next. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her strength lay in what she held, a folder, unassuming yet heavy with truth. She stepped to the table, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and opened it with deliberate care. The jury tracked her every move, breaths held. "You've heard their story," she said, nodding toward the prosecution. "Now let's talk about what really happened." She faced the judge. An older man with eyes like honed steel, and straightened. "Your Honor, we have evidence, new, lawful, and critical, that dismantles the officer's account." The judge leaned forward, his chair creaking faintly. "Proceed," he said, voice gravelly but firm. She nodded, then locked eyes with the DA, whose smirk had long since faded. "The defense submits classified documents. Recently declassified by the CIA." The courtroom rippled with shock, gasps, whispers, a reporter's pen scratching furiously. The DA's face twisted, confusion warring with dread. Clayton and Reynolds shifted, their easy slouch replaced by tight jaws and darting glances. The attorney pressed on, her words slicing through the haze. "These papers reveal the accused isn't a criminal, isn't some dealer peddling drugs. He's a deep-cover CIA operative, embedded in a classified domestic operation." The room froze. A woman in the gallery whispered, "No way," her voice barely audible over the thudding hearts around her. The jury sat up, spines rigid, as the judge peered at the folder. "Are you saying he's a federal agent?" he asked, incredulity threading his tone. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, unflinching. "And that evidence they found?" She turned, her gaze pinning Clayton and Reynolds like moths to a board. "It was never there." Reynolds squirmed, his fingers twitching against his knee. Clayton's jaw clenched so hard it might have cracked. "This was a setup," she continued, her voice steady as stone. The DA stammered, "Your Honor, we weren't," but the judge cut him off with a raised hand, sharp and final. "I want to see it," he snapped. She handed the folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench with the reverence of a man carrying a live grenade. The judge flipped through, his eyes narrowing, his breath escaping in a slow, heavy sigh. Then he looked up. "I want to hear from the defendant." Now. For the first time, the accused stood. Every eye latched onto him, the air thick with expectation. His movements were precise. Not hurried, not uncertain, just controlled, like a man who'd spent years mastering himself. The judge gestured sharply. "State your name for the record." A beat of silence hung, heavy and electric. Before he spoke, Special Agent Xavier Cole. The room exploded, gasps, shouts, reporters scrambling as if the floor had split beneath them. Clayton and Reynolds went rigid. The DA's face drained to ash, and the judge slammed his gavel, barking, "Order." The chaos ebbed, but the energy pulsed wild and alive. Xavier's voice cut through, calm but unyielding. "I've been undercover with the CIA for 7 years, targeting domestic corruption and intelligence threats. That night wasn't random." He turned, his gaze boring into the officers. "I was investigating them, Clayton and Reynolds, for a pattern of false arrests. They were already on a federal watch list. They just didn't know it. Clayton's fists balled, his knuckles whitening. Reynolds shifted, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool air. The jury leaned closer, rapt, as even the judge's stern mask faltered. Xavier didn't flinch. They framed me to cover their tracks. The defense attorney stepped forward, her voice crisp. Your Honor, we have more. She nodded to the courtroom doors, which swung open with a groan. A federal agent strode in, his suit crisp. A laptop clutched in his hand. He moved with purpose, setting it on the evidence table and firing it up. A few clicks, and the screen flared to life. The room watched, breathless. As the missing body cam footage rolled. There it was, the traffic stop, the search, Reynolds' hand slipping under the seat, planting the bag with a practiced ease. The crowd erupted again. Reporters lunging for their notes, the DA's jaw dropping as if unhinged. Clayton surged to his feet, voice cracking. That's fake. The judge's glare was ice. Sit down, officer, he snapped. Each word a blade. Reynolds sank lower, his face a mask of defeat. The jury's eyes burned with certainty, no more convincing needed. But the reckoning wasn't done. Chaos reigned as the jury whispered. Their murmurs a rising tide. The prosecution crumbled, a ship taking on water, while Clayton and Reynolds sat like cornered animals, the weight of their choices crashing down. The judge straightened. His voice booming. Bailiff, take officers Clayton and Reynolds into custody pending investigation. Clayton bolted upright, desperation clawing at his throat. This is a setup, he yelled. His voice splintering as the bailiff seized his arm. Let go. Reynolds didn't fight, just sat, head bowed, a man already broken. The gavel fell again, a thunderclap sealing their fate. In that moment, justice wasn't just a word, it was a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Xavier stood tall, his silence louder than any shout. A testament to resilience against a system that thrived on power unchecked. The officers had wielded their authority like a club, never imagining it could turn back on them. Now. As the cuffs clicked shut, the lesson sank deep: abuse power, and the consequences will find you, relentless and inevitable. The courtroom emptied, but the echo of that truth lingered. A warning carved in the air. The air in Blank Hollow hung heavy, thick with the weight of inevitability, as Xavier Cole stood motionless in the courtroom. He didn't fidget. Didn't let a flicker of triumph cross his face, didn't even allow his lips to twitch into the faintest smirk. His eyes, steady and unyielding, followed the two figures, Clayton and Reynolds, shuffling out of the room, their wrists bound by the cold bite of handcuffs. The same restraints they'd once fastened around the wrists of others. Countless others, gleamed dully under the fluorescent lights. There was a bitter poetry in it, a symmetry that Xavier felt deep in his bones, though he refused to let it show. Around him, the jury sat in their box, a silent gallery of faces etched with a mix of exhaustion and quiet realization, watching the scene unfold like mourners at a long-overdue funeral. The district attorney, a man whose polished suit now seemed to hang on him like a wilted flag, scrambled to his feet. His voice trembled slightly as he addressed the bench, desperation seeping into every syllable. Your Honor, we had no knowledge of their actions, we couldn't have known, but before he could finish, the judge's gavel-sharp voice sliced through the room, cutting off the plea like a guillotine dropping on a flimsy excuse. Then you failed to do your job, the judge snapped, his tone as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. The words reverberated, hanging in the air, a condemnation not just of the DA but of a system that had let the rot fester too long. He turned his piercing gaze to Xavier, softening only slightly. Agent Cole, you're free to go. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room. It was over. Or so it seemed. But beyond the courtroom's oak-paneled walls, the world was stirring, restless and ravenous for the story that was only beginning to unfold. Outside. The courthouse steps teemed with chaos. Reporters swarmed like bees around a broken hive, their microphones thrust forward, camera flashes slicing through the late afternoon haze. Xavier stepped into the fray, his attorney at his side, a steady presence amid the storm. The air buzzed with shouted questions, overlapping in a frantic cacophony. Agent Cole, what's next? What does this mean for the cases those officers tainted? How far does this corruption reach? The weight of their curiosity pressed against him, but Xavier didn't flinch. He stopped. Turning to face the sea of lenses and outstretched arms, his voice calm yet resonant, cutting through the noise like a lighthouse beam through fog. This isn't just about me, he said. Each word deliberate. It's about every single person who was locked away, silenced, because no one believed their cries. And now? Now we dig up the rest of it. The reporters jostled. Pens scratching, cameras whirring, capturing the moment, a spark that promised to ignite something far larger. The trial might have ended, but the real battle was just taking its first breath. In the weeks that followed, the fallout rippled outward, unstoppable. Every case tied to Clayton and Reynolds, those disgraced officers now stripped of their badges, was pried open. Examined under the harsh light of scrutiny. Dozens of convictions crumbled like sandcastles against a rising tide. And the voices of the wrongfully condemned, men and women who'd languished in shadows, finally broke free, raw and trembling with years of buried pain. The police department buckled under a federal investigation, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of agents and the rustle of files being unearthed. The DA, his career in tatters. Resigned in disgrace, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffle as he slipped out a back door, avoiding the cameras. The city itself seemed to fracture, torn apart by the jagged edges of truth. Its people grappling with the realization that justice had been a hollow promise for far too long. For Xavier, though, this was never about settling scores. One night, weeks later, he stood alone outside the courthouse, the air cool against his skin, the distant hum of traffic blending with the fading echo of news vans that had long since departed. The sky stretched wide above him, a canvas of stars obscured by the city's glow. He wasn't thinking about victory or vengeance, his mind lingered on the faces of those he'd never met. The ones whose stories mirrored his own. A figure approached, a young man, barely 20, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if bracing against a wind only he could feel. They locked me up too, he said, his voice a fragile thread, barely rising above the night's quiet. Fake charges. No one ever listened. His eyes darted to the ground, then up to Xavier's. Searching for something, validation, maybe, or just a flicker of understanding. Xavier held his gaze, steady as ever. They listen now, he replied, soft but firm. The young man nodded, a small, shaky movement, and slipped back into the darkness, leaving Xavier alone again. That moment crystallized it for him, the truth was a living thing, restless and fierce. You could bury it beneath lies. Twist it into knots, lock it behind bars, but you couldn't kill it. Not forever. When it broke free, as it had now, it reshaped everything in its path. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force. And its absence left scars. Xavier knew this story, his story, their story, had to be shouted, shared, until the world couldn't look away. Corruption, when exposed, didn't just crumble. It left a warning etched in stone. Power, when abused, would face its reckoning. Meanwhile, miles away in Lexington, Kentucky, the sun dipped low over Holliston Park. Casting golden streaks across the grass, painting the quiet green space in hues of warmth and shadow. It was a place of simple rhythms, parents nudging strollers along winding paths. Retirees ambling with canes tapping softly against pavement, joggers tracing loops around the pond where ducks drifted lazily. The breeze carried faint echoes of children's laughter from the playground, mingling with the rustle of leaves overhead. At a weathered picnic table near the walking trail, 16-year-old Brielle Adams sat, her world narrowed to the glow of her laptop screen. She slid the device from her backpack with care, tilting it just so to dodge the sun's glare. Her open notebook sprawled beside her, pages crowded with scribbled notes, highlighted quotes from civil rights cases she'd pored over for hours. Her fingers danced across the keys, her focus absolute. The park's gentle hum fading into a distant blur. This spot was her refuge, a haven she'd claimed since she was old enough to pedal her bike here alone. Its familiarity a quiet comfort she never questioned. Across the way, Gerald Whitmore perched on a park bench. His posture rigid despite the casual press of his polo shirt and the gleam of an expensive watch circling his wrist. His routine was clockwork: stroll to the park, scroll through his phone. Savor a fleeting escape from the tidy house a few blocks away. But today, something jarred his rhythm. His eyes snagged on Brielle, alone, engrossed. Her presence an anomaly in his neatly ordered world. She wasn't loud, wasn't disruptive, yet something about her gnawed at him. Too comfortable, he thought, his arms folding tightly across his chest. Too at ease, as if she owned the space. He scanned the park, half expecting a parent or friend to appear and claim her, but the tables around her stayed empty. To Gerald, her solitude was a red flag. A puzzle piece that didn't fit. He shifted, his grip tightening around his phone, the unease coiling in his gut like a spring wound too tight. She'd been there too long. Kids didn't linger in parks like this, not alone, not in this neighborhood. His mind raced, stitching together possibilities. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe she was up to something, scouting, plotting, who knew? He watched her reach into her backpack, pulling out a water bottle with a casual flick of her wrist, her calm only deepening his suspicion. Too relaxed, he decided, his jaw tightening. He checked his watch, nearly 6, the park thinning out as dusk crept in. No one else seemed to notice her, no one else cared. But that didn't mean he was wrong. With a sharp exhale, he unlocked his phone, thumb hovering over the screen, a heartbeat of hesitation giving way to resolve. He dialed the Lexington Police Department, his voice low and measured as he spoke. "Hi, yeah, I'd like to report something suspicious. I'm at Holliston Park, there's a girl here, teenager. Just sitting at a table with a laptop. Alone. I don't know what she's doing, but it doesn't look right." The dispatcher's neutral tone didn't sway him. He pressed on, convinced he was doing his duty. Brielle didn't hear the cruiser's tires crunching gravel at first, too lost in her typing, her thoughts weaving through the history of justice she was documenting. The sound was background noise. A routine hum she'd grown used to over years of park visits. But when a second vehicle rolled up, the double echo pulled her from her trance. She glanced up, tugging an earbud free. Her pulse quickening as 2 officers stepped out. The taller one, lean and purposeful, adjusted his belt as he approached, the stockier one lingered by the car. His rigid stance and sharp gaze locking onto her like a spotlight. "Excuse me, miss," the taller officer said, his voice polite but edged with authority. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Brielle blinked, caught off guard. Homework," she stammered, gesturing to her laptop and notes, confusion tightening her chest. The officer nodded, but his face stayed blank. "We got a call about a suspicious person in the park. Said you've been here a while." Suspicious person. The words hit her like a slap, her stomach twisting as she scanned the park. Wondering who'd seen a threat in her quiet focus. The stockier officer exhaled, impatience flickering in his eyes. "Got some ID?" he called. His hand resting near his holster, a detail that didn't escape her. She hesitated, her voice sharpening. What for? The air shifted, tension coiling between them. Just a routine check. The taller one said, but Brielle knew better. She'd seen kids her age at these tables, laughing, carefree, kids who didn't look like her, who never got asked for ID. Her heart pounded. Anger and fear tangling inside her, as the reality settled in. Someone had turned her sanctuary into a battleground, and the fight for her voice was only beginning. In both Xavier's courtroom and Brielle's park, the lesson burned clear: justice falters when power twists truth, but its collapse leaves echoes, consequences that demand to be heard, felt, and answered. The air in the park was thick with late afternoon humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made every movement feel heavier than it should. Brielle sat at a weathered picnic table. Her laptop open, her fingers hovering over the keys as she tried to focus on her homework. Her backpack rested beside her, a jumble of textbooks and pens spilling out. Evidence of a long day at school. She barely noticed the faint tremble in her hands as she reached for her bag, not yet, at least. Her heart gave a quiet thud when she heard the crunch of boots on gravel behind her. She didn't turn around immediately, hoping it was just someone passing by, but the sound stopped too close. Too deliberate. "Ma'am," came a gruff voice, low and clipped. Brielle's breath hitched. She turned her head just enough to see the stocky officer standing a few feet away. His broad frame casting a shadow over her table. His hand rested lightly on the edge of his holster, fingers brushing the leather like it was second nature. Her chest tightened. She knew that stance. That subtle readiness, she'd seen it in movies, heard about it from her mother, but feeling it directed at her was something else entirely. Her eyes darted to the second officer, taller and leaner. His badge glinting in the fading sunlight. Reynolds, it read. He stood a step back, watching her with a gaze that felt like it was peeling her apart. "I'm just grabbing my wallet," she said. Her voice shrinking into itself, barely above a whisper. She moved with painstaking care, her fingers trembling now as they fumbled for the zipper on her bag. Every motion was slow, exaggerated. A silent plea woven into each gesture, "I'm not a threat. Please don't think I'm a threat." Her mind raced, images of news stories, whispered warnings from her mom about moments just like this, where a single misstep could unravel everything. She pulled out her wallet, the worn leather slipping slightly in her sweaty grip, and handed over her ID with both hands, as if offering a fragile truce. Reynolds took it, his eyes flicking between the card and her face. The scrutiny burned. "You live around here?" he asked. His tone flat but edged with something she couldn't quite place, doubt, maybe, or suspicion. Brielle exhaled, a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. 5 blocks away," she said, forcing the words out. She watched his face, searching for a sign of what came next. A flicker crossed his features, recognition, perhaps. Or the faintest hint of uncertainty, but before he could respond, a sharp honk sliced through the tension like a blade. Tires squealed as a sleek black sedan jerked to a stop near the curb. The sound jarring against the park's lazy quiet. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Olivia Barrett. Her navy blazer hugged her frame. Still crisp despite hours spent in courtrooms and offices, her tailored slacks swaying with each purposeful stride. Her heels struck the pavement with a rhythm that echoed authority. A metronome of confidence cutting through the murmurs of the gathering crowd. She moved like a storm gathering strength, her presence shifting the air around her. Brielle's shoulders stiffened. Her fingers curling into her palms as relief and dread tangled inside her. Olivia's sharp gaze swept the scene, taking it all in with the precision of a hawk circling prey. She saw her daughter first, Brielle's rigid posture, the unreadable mask on her face hiding the storm of fear beneath. Then the officers, Reynolds clutching the ID. His posture faltering under her scrutiny, Martinez, stocky and unyielding, his hand still hovering near his belt like a coiled snake. Beyond them, a small crowd had formed, a mother by the swings. Her hushed whispers carrying on the breeze, a jogger slowing his pace, his curiosity outweighing his workout, and then Gerald Whitmore, perched on a bench across the park. His stillness setting him apart. Olivia's eyes lingered on him for a fraction of a second, a knowing glint sparking there before she turned her attention back to the officers. "Officers," she said. Her voice smooth as polished steel, firm enough to make Reynolds straighten instinctively. "Is there a problem here?" The question wasn't a request, it was a challenge. Laced with the weight of someone who'd spent years bending rooms to her will. Reynolds cleared his throat, a nervous tick betraying his composure. We were just," he began, but Martinez cut in. His tone sharper, less willing to bend. "We received a report about a suspicious individual." Olivia's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching faintly beneath her flawless exterior. "And that suspicious individual," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous calm, "is my daughter?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Brielle let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, a quiet "mom" slipping past her lips. Olivia didn't break eye contact with the officers, her presence a wall between them and her daughter. "Did you?" she pressed, her words slicing through the awkward pause. "And what exactly made her suspicious?" Reynolds shifted his weight, his fingers tightening around Brielle's ID. "Well, someone called it in," he stammered, his confidence fraying at the edges. Olivia nodded, but her expression sharpened, her eyes narrowing like a blade honing itself. "Right. And did this someone mention what crime she was committing? Or does sitting in a park with a laptop count as probable cause these days?" Her sarcasm was a whip, cracking through the air. And Martinez bristled, squaring his shoulders. "Look, ma'am, we're just following up. If there's no issue, we'll be on our way." "Not yet," Olivia said, stepping closer, her voice a quiet thunder. Martinez shifted, a subtle flinch he couldn't hide, and she caught it, the crack in his armor. "I want to know who made the call," she demanded, her tone leaving no room for evasion. Reynolds cleared his throat again, louder this time, a nervous habit surfacing. "We can't disclose that." Olivia's lips curved into a slow, humorless smile, the kind that promised trouble. "Of course you can't," she said, then straightened to her full height, her presence towering despite her modest stature. "My name is Olivia Barrett. I'm a federal prosecutor. And if you think I don't know my daughter's rights, you're gravely mistaken." The shift was instantaneous. Martinez froze, his eyes widening as realization dawned. A flicker of panic breaking through his stoic facade. Reynolds adjusted his belt, his gaze dropping to the ID in his hand as if it had suddenly grown hot. For the first time, he looked unsure. His earlier authority crumbling under the weight of her words. Olivia didn't relent. "So let me get this straight," she said, folding her arms, her voice calm but cutting deeper with every syllable. "A man calls in a suspicious person, a 16-year-old girl doing homework in a public park, and instead of questioning the validity of that, you show up with your hands near your holsters?" Martinez squared his shoulders again, defiance flaring. "Ma'am, we were just following protocol." Olivia tilted her head, her eyes glinting with something fierce. "Oh? And what's the protocol for racial profiling?" The accusation hung there, heavy and unyielding. Brielle's heart pounded in her chest, her hands clammy as she watched her mother dismantle them. She'd seen Olivia in action before, cross-examining witnesses, commanding courtrooms, but this was different. This was personal, raw, and Brielle felt a surge of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. Reynolds swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Look, we didn't know she was your daughter." Olivia's brow arched, a silent dare. Would it have made a difference? He hesitated. And that pause was an answer in itself, a confession he couldn't voice. Martinez exhaled sharply through his nose, his discomfort palpable, but Olivia pressed forward, unshaken. "Let me explain something to you, officers," she said, each word deliberate, measured, like she was delivering a verdict. "I've spent decades dismantling cases that start just like this, cases where a phone call turns into harassment, harassment turns into escalation. And escalation turns into something that destroys lives." She gestured toward Brielle, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "You saw a black teenager sitting alone. And instead of asking questions, you assumed. Instead of thinking for yourselves, you let someone else's bias dictate your response. You let a call from a stranger, tell you my daughter was a threat." Martinez shifted again, his jaw tightening. "That's not what happened," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Olivia challenged, her tone daring him to try again. "Because I'd love to hear another explanation." Neither officer spoke. Brielle watched them, her breath shallow, marveling at how her mother's relentless pressure stripped away their bravado, leaving them exposed. Then Olivia smiled, a small, calculated curve of her lips that made both men flinch. "But I'm not going to file a complaint. Not yet." Reynolds's jaw tightened, a flicker of relief warring with unease. Martinez's shoulders relaxed, but only slightly, his guard still up. Olivia turned, her gaze sweeping the park until it landed on Gerald Whitmore. She'd known from the moment she arrived, he was the one. The guilt was etched into his face, plain as day. Before she'd even stepped out of her car. "I want to talk to the man who made the call," she said, her voice carrying across the grass. Gerald froze, his hands gripping the edge of the bench so hard his knuckles whitened. For the last few minutes, he'd been a silent spectator, perched on the sidelines, watching the scene unfold with a detached curiosity. He'd expected the officers to handle it, to move on, to validate his quiet unease. Now, that unease turned to dread as Olivia's piercing gaze locked onto him. She took a slow step forward, her heels clicking ominously against the pavement. "I assumed that was you," she said, her voice level but edged with something cold. Gerald cleared his throat, his mouth dry. I was just being cautious," he stammered, his voice cracking under the strain. "I didn't mean," Olivia tilted her head, cutting him off without raising her voice. "Didn't mean what?" "Didn't mean to waste police resources. Didn't mean to assume my daughter didn't belong here. Didn't mean to weaponize your discomfort." Each question landed like a stone, and Gerald's face flushed, heat creeping up his neck. "I just thought," he began, but Olivia finished for him, her tone biting. "You thought she looked out of place. You saw a black girl alone in a public space, and your first instinct was to call the police instead of minding your own business." Silence swallowed the park. Gerald's eyes darted to the officers, searching for an ally, but they stood mute, their own discomfort pinning them in place. Brielle's chest ached, a raw, exposed feeling clawing at her. How many times had someone like Gerald looked at her and seen the same thing, a threat, an outsider, without ever saying it aloud? "I was just trying to look out for the neighborhood," Gerald muttered, his voice barely audible, a weak defense crumbling under its own weight. Olivia let out a low, humorless laugh, the sound sharp enough to make him flinch. "Oh, were you?" She gestured toward the picnic table where, earlier, two white teenagers had lounged, laughing and scrolling on their phones. They'd come and gone without a whisper of suspicion, without a single glance from Gerald. "You didn't call when they were here," she pointed out, her voice steady but searing. "Why is that?" Gerald's throat bobbed, his hands tightening around his phone as if it could shield him. He had no answer, and the absence of one was deafening. "That's the problem," Olivia said, stepping closer. Her presence towering over him despite the distance. "People like you think you're protecting something when all you're doing is causing harm." She gestured at Brielle. Her voice softening but no less firm. "You didn't just disrupt her afternoon. You confirmed everything I've had to teach her about how the world sees her. You reinforced a fear that one day this might not end with just a conversation, that next time, the wrong officer might show up." Gerald's face paled, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right. And that knowledge twisted inside him, sharp and unrelenting. Across the park, the jogger who'd been pretending not to listen abandoned his stretches, turning away as if the truth was too heavy to bear. A woman pushing a stroller quickened her pace, her head down, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. They'd all heard. And the air felt charged with the echoes of Olivia's rebuke. She turned back to the officers, her expression unyielding. "I hope you think twice next time. I hope you ask yourselves why you didn't stop to question the call before you came charging in." Reynolds nodded stiffly, his jaw tight. Martinez muttered something under his breath, too low to catch. Then turned sharply on his heel. Without another word, the two retreated to their patrol car, their footsteps heavy with the weight of their retreat. Gerald stood quickly, his movements jerky, as if he could outrun the spotlight now fixed on him. But Olivia's gaze lingered, a silent reminder that justice wasn't just about laws, it was about accountability. About the consequences of wielding power carelessly. Brielle watched him go, her heart still racing, but a quiet strength settled inside her, rooted in her mother's unwavering stand. The park fell silent again, but the lesson hung in the air, inescapable. Unchecked assumptions and abused authority could unravel lives, and those who set them in motion couldn't hide from the fallout. Olivia stepped back, her shoulders stiff but her movements deliberate, allowing him to slip past her without so much as a fleeting glance in his direction. The man scurried away. His head bowed low as if the weight of the moment pressed down on his neck. His fingers clutched his phone with a desperate tightness, the knuckles widening against the sleek black case. As though it were his last tether to a world that had just tilted off its axis. He vanished down the cracked sidewalk, swallowed by the lengthening shadows of the late afternoon, leaving behind a ripple of tension that lingered like a bitter aftertaste. Brielle, standing a few paces away, finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, a sharp, shaky exhale that trembled in the crisp air. Her mother's hand found her back, warm and steady, a quiet anchor amid the storm swirling inside her. "You okay, Brielle?" her mother asked. Her voice soft but laced with concern, the kind that came from years of knowing her daughter's silences as well as her words. Brielle nodded, but the motion was stiff. Her throat tight with unspoken words. "You shouldn't have had to come here at all," she managed, her voice thin and strained, like a wire pulled too taut. Olivia sighed. A sound heavy with understanding, and together they turned toward the car, leaving behind the uniformed officers, the curious onlookers. And Gerald Whitmore, a man who would carry this day in his memory far longer than he'd ever anticipated. Today, he'd learned a hard truth: power, when wielded carelessly, could unravel in ways that left a man exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. As Brielle and Olivia walked toward the parking lot, the world around them seemed to shift, though the park itself remained unchanged. The winding paths still snaked through the grass, worn smooth by countless footsteps. The clusters of trees stood tall, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, and the golden sunlight still poured through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. But now, there was a heaviness in the air. An electric charge that prickled against the skin, as if the very atmosphere had taken note of what had transpired. People noticed, too. A woman by the swings. Her hands resting on the chains as her toddler kicked his legs in delight, paused mid-push. Her lips parted slightly. Her breath catching as she stole a glance at the scene unfolding nearby, not staring outright, but unable to look away entirely, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and unease. A man walking his golden retriever, earbuds dangling from his ears, slowed his pace. He'd been humming along to his podcast moments ago, lost in some distant narration, but now his face tightened. His jaw clenching as he cast a sidelong glance at Brielle and Olivia. His dog tugged at the leash, oblivious, but the man's steps faltered, hesitant. As though he'd stumbled into something he wasn't meant to witness. Over by the basketball court, a group of teenagers, lanky boys in oversized hoodies, froze mid-shove. Their laughter dying on their lips. One of them, a kid no older than 16, with dark hair falling into his eyes, caught Brielle's gaze for a fleeting second. His expression flickered, part defiance, part shame, before he ducked his head and turned away, kicking at a pebble with the toe of his sneaker. The officers had already dispersed. Their radios crackling faintly as they retreated to their patrol cars. Gerald was gone, too, or so they thought. But the moment clung to the air like damp fog, refusing to dissipate. Brielle reached the car, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the handle as she exhaled again, sharper this time, a release of the pressure building in her chest. "Are you sure that's it?" she asked, her voice tight, almost brittle, as though it might snap under the weight of her frustration. Olivia pressed the key fob, the locks clicking open with a soft thud. "For today, yes," she replied, her tone steady but not dismissive. Brielle bit the inside of her cheek, hard enough to taste the faint metallic tang of blood. The anger simmered just beneath her skin. A restless heat she couldn't shake. "For today," she echoed, the words tasting hollow in her mouth. Olivia turned then, really turned. Her eyes locking onto her daughter's with an intensity that cut through the haze. She knew that tone, the quiet storm brewing in Brielle's voice, the one that signaled unresolved hurt. Unanswered questions. "Tomorrow?" Brielle asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper, fragile but insistent. Olivia didn't flinch, didn't soften the truth. "Tomorrow, we keep going," she said. Her words firm, resolute, carrying the weight of a promise forged through years of battles fought side by side. "Like we always do." Brielle nodded, but her jaw remained clenched. Her eyes drifting to the window as she wrestled with the emotions churning inside her, relief, rage, and a gnawing uncertainty she couldn't name. Olivia didn't press her further. She simply opened the driver's side door and slid in, the leather creaking faintly under her weight. Brielle followed, tugging the seatbelt across her chest with a mechanical precision. Her gaze fixed straight ahead, unseeing, as the engine hummed to life. As they pulled away, the tires crunching over loose gravel, Gerald Whitmore remained behind. Perched on a weathered bench at the far edge of the park. He watched the taillights of their car shrink into the distance, two red pinpricks swallowed by the dusk. His hand still gripped his phone. The screen dark and lifeless, his thumbs hovering uselessly over the glass. For once, he didn't scroll, didn't text, didn't call. He just sat there, motionless. The cool wood of the bench pressing into his thighs, the faint chirping of crickets rising around him. For the first time in years, Gerald didn't know what to do. The control he'd always taken for granted, the authority he'd worn like a second skin, had slipped through his fingers today, leaving him raw and reeling. He'd acted on instinct, on fear. On a story he'd told himself about the girl with the laptop, and now he sat alone with the consequences. His chest tightened as he replayed the scene, the officers' stern voices. Olivia's commanding presence, the way Brielle had looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse, something that pierced deeper. Disappointment. He'd misjudged her. And the realization gnawed at him, a slow, relentless ache. Moments like this unfolded every day, in parks and parking lots, on street corners and subway platforms. Not always with a federal prosecutor swooping in at the 11th hour, not always with witnesses pausing to take note, but the ingredients were the same, assumptions born of fear. Choices made in haste, power abused without a second thought. Brielle hadn't done anything wrong. She'd sat at a picnic table, her laptop open. Her fingers dancing across the keys as she typed out her thoughts, maybe a school paper, maybe a journal entry, maybe nothing at all. But to Gerald, she'd been a threat. A figure his mind had twisted into something suspicious, something dangerous. What if Olivia hadn't arrived, her badge gleaming and her voice cutting through the chaos? What if the officers had been less patient, their hands itching for cuffs instead of clipboards? What if Brielle, flustered and afraid, had raised her voice, demanded answers? Pushed back against the absurdity of it all? Would they have let her walk away, or would the story have veered into darker territory, a night in a cell, a record stained, a life altered? The answer hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Justice, in moments like these, wasn't a guarantee, it was a fragile thread, easily snapped by bias and perception. The lesson here stretched beyond Brielle and Gerald, beyond the park and its golden sunlight. It was about the stories people told themselves, about the stranger on the bench, the kid in the hoodie, the woman with the stroller, and the consequences that followed when those stories turned into actions. Gerald had assumed he held the upper hand, that his judgment was sound. His authority unquestionable. But power, when misused, didn't just harm the powerless, it left the powerful hollow, too, stripped of the illusions they'd clung to. Brielle and Olivia drove away, carrying their resilience like armor, while Gerald stayed behind, grappling with a truth he couldn't outrun. Some mistakes left marks that couldn't be erased. The next time you find yourself sizing up a stranger, weaving a narrative from a glance or a gesture, stop. Ask yourself, what am I seeing? Why am I seeing it this way? And what might happen if I let this story guide my hand? Because assumptions aren't harmless, they're sparks that can ignite lives, and some fires burn too deep to extinguish.